Here, Provincial Police, where's your emergency?
He came in the house with a gun. My sister's screaming and he's lying on the ground.
Everything was as if it was a play. Carl opened the door. Anastasia walked right out the door. I walked in the house, I opened the door, and Natalie's right there. It was like as if it was supposed to be. I am innocent. I done nothing wrong.
A deadly rampage that crisscrossed the picturesque Madawaska Valley in eastern Ontario. Early in the morning, a gunman drove to 3 different communities, killing 3 women.
A little closer, making the arrest. Cut you. We're just cuffing him now.
Can you please confirm this is Basil?
Basil Palutsky.
10-4.
Really, all I want to know is, well, what's your understanding of why we're here right now, Basil?
You're here trying to get me to say something to incriminate me in any way you possibly can.
The 3 individuals that were murdered are Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuziak, and Natalie Warmerdam. Now, obviously, as of right now, you have been arrested for murder. Okay, so if you'd like to phone a lawyer.
For killing, not murder. I didn't murder anybody.
What's the difference between killing and murder?
Thou shalt not murder. Commandments.
And I believe it's actually thou shalt not kill.
You're wrong. You better start reading the Bible.
Yeah?
Yeah. Find an old version before they changed it. My only will is also murder. That's all I do. It's murder, kill somebody that's innocent.
So, in terms of Carol and Anastasia and Natalie, would you say you killed them or murdered them?
I killed them because they were not innocent. They were guilty. I was innocent. I done nothing wrong in God's eyes.
This is a guy who likes to think that he is a good Christian and that he is a good person and these people who wrong him are bad people. It's a very, I think, unconvincing, I'm a good guy, I'm the victim presentation. One thing that approaches psychopathy with it is it's really lacking an awareness that no one's really gonna buy his sob story.
He's just trying to rationalize and justify his actions in a way that make moral sense, but it's not at all believable.
When you woke up, what can you remember about that?
I left around 8 o'clock. I was beside myself, like I was looking at this from over there. I could see myself.
But what did you see yourself doing?
Walking from the house to the car. I believe that God was telling me where to turn, because I was driving on roads that I didn't even know where they were going. And I was wondering, what the hell am I doing here? And then in a bunch of little towns.
It felt as if God was telling me. So it's kind of distancing language. He's not really coming close to taking responsibility and certainly not feeling remorse.
He believes he has a special relationship with God. It's his ego talking, that he is special, he's a chosen one, that he is above the rest of us in his ability to decide who dies and who lives.
I just drove in. I And I remember thinking that God is really helping me, because when I went to Carl walked right outside. I said, "Why do you hate me?" And then she closed the door. I was right there. And then I broke the window with my elbow. And I reached in and I unlocked the door. And she said, "This is not you, babe. This is not you." You know what? Then she told me that her new boyfriend, Dave, was coming over because the hydro was out. And I said, "You're lying to me again." And there was a cable TV coil. I picked it up and I hit her with it and I wrapped it around her head. And she just kept saying, "This is not you, Basil. This is not you." But this doesn't mean I wasn't doing that. I see myself doing that. Doesn't make sense. I was over there. I'm here. I'm like a camera, and as if I was watching with a camera myself.
He talks about watching himself on camera. I think that's also part of his own narcissism. You know, look at what I did. Particularly the more psychopathic somebody is and the more narcissistic somebody is, watching themselves is really an ultimate honor.
In fact, I went crazy, isn't it? And I wasn't putting up with no more. I'm not. I'm going to shoot the. Leave me alone.
So how long have you known Carol for?
Approximately 3 years. Before.
And are you in a relationship with her?
Yes. Told her, "Carol, you asked me to do stuff for you, and then when I do it, you tell me that I wasn't supposed to do it." She was, I don't think bipolar. Carol, you just have to make the mind, you keep changing your mind.
Basil Barutsky, when you pay attention to his crimes and what he's done, is very classically a chronic domestic violence perpetrator. He's a misogynist, and he's a psychopath. He has a difficult time not getting his way. He has a complete lack of respect for women and sees them as objects. He is devoid of typical emotion and attachment to people. He has a history of stalking Carol, of showing up at her home unannounced, showing up to do work on her property that she didn't ask for, and while she's not there. Here's an excerpt from a letter that Barutsky wrote Carol. "I'm a deep thinker. I worry about the world, the planet, the people, the pollution. That's me. I can't change me. I am a loving, caring human being. I am a good person." He's trying to convince her that he's this horribly misunderstood person. And you see that time and time again with domestic violence. Perpetrators justify their own rage. If you would just behave, I wouldn't need to do this to you.
So Monday, I was at the cottage, and that's when Carol was, that's when she said that her and her man called me BF. She told me that they had this joke about me being BF, best friend, the guy that would do anything. She said that they thought it was funny, and she was laughing in the house.
Certainly, knowing that people are joking about him, it's very challenging to his ego. It's a challenge to his masculinity, his role as a provider, his sexual potency. He's not a competitor anymore. He's not a romantic competitor. He's your old BF. He's your friend. He is not somebody to be threatened by. I can imagine that being intensely threatening to him. And so that's that kind of egotistical, self-centered component that you might see in psychopathy.
My guess would be when he killed Carol, he actually felt good. He felt a release of the rage, humiliation, shame.
I remember driving the car. I'm outside the door. And I remember God's helping me do what's right. God's making this easy. Because when I got to Anastasia, she walked out the door. Wasn't even at the door, she just walked out. I asked Anastasia, I just said, why did you lie in court? And she said, I didn't. It was as if it was supposed to be. She turned around and walked in, I walked right in behind her, and the gun went off. There was a little island, and she was standing, and she just went down, and the gun went off after she went down.
Borutsky was convicted back in 2014 of assault and for attempting to choke, suffocate, or strangle Anastasia Cusick, along with a charge of mischief for burning her property. He spent nearly 2 years in prison.
I wasn't guilty. Because it just lies. I sat in jail for a whole year, rotted like a dog, knowing that all I did was read the Bible. Just read. Gonna be trapped, punched out. Because old guys like me that are crippled, you're a mark, you're fun for all. That's a cruel place, man. I never hit that woman. Anastasia beat the out of me. She burned all my clothes. She burned my boots. She burned everything. Oh, I kept that house from burning down so times. She was going to throw a can of acid. She was crazy. She's bipolar.
He believes every woman in his life is bipolar. That's what he's talking about with the 3 victims. And ultimately, what he's really doing is trying to discredit them. He's trying to say, don't believe them, they're irrational. Borutsky's blaming the victim, things that he's responsible for, actions that he ultimately was proven in a court of law to have done. He now assigns to her. His narrative of his history is that he was wrongfully convicted, he was wrongfully sent to jail. What we know in public record is that Borutsky served 2 years in prison for seriously assaulting Anastasia.
There was another girl there. She had toothbrush in her mouth. She said, who are you? I said, I'll kill you. And that's all. And the gun went off. I said, God, what do I do now? I told him to get in the car and drive down the highway. And then to the farm. Whose farm is this? It wasn't anything that was. It's not because she lied.
What happened when you went to Natalie's farm on Tuesday?
What happened? I just drove in, walked in the door. She was sitting there. When they're in the corner, I follow her. Go, walk her. That's it.
What happened to Natalie's?
I asked a question. And as soon as I asked the question, she lied. And that's what it's just like lie bang. Next thing you know, the police are there and I'm charged with threatening to hang him when all I said is, if you don't smarten up, I'll string you up. Meaning, listen, kid, do I deserve to go to jail for that? No. 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 So she used the system. The whole thing is so stupid.
One thing that abusers often do that terrifies women is they threaten their children. They try to figure out the best way to manipulate, control, and get obedience and submission from the woman. So it's about control. And if he's not getting enough control, then you hit where it hurts the most. And for mothers, it's the child, so he threatens the safety of her son.
Ultimately, his narrative of this, once again, is that he's misunderstood. And that Natalie is actually to blame. She's the manipulative person. Natalie made the decision that any protective parent would, which was to pursue charges, to use the legal system to help protect her.
So what did these women do to you that made you have to kill them? That's the burning question of the day.
I was put in jail twice, wrongfully. All because you believe the lies. Use police, and then take the lies and you project them to the courts. Use the police. Because yous have attacked me. Yous are the end. Over and over and over.
He's full of self-pity and consistent deflection of responsibility and blaming everyone else for his actions. He's always the victim. This kind of manipulation and minimization and denial and twisting of reality is very, very common in domestic abusers, but it is also a psychopathic trait.
How do you feel about what's happened to these women, Basil? How do you feel right now? Not at the time is what I'm getting at. Right now, me and you in this room.
Empty. Empty.
Barutsky is a psychopath, and that's what you expect to see in somebody who's a psychopath. He doesn't spend a lot of time taking responsibility for his own behavior. Affect and emotions are shallow, he's impulsive, and he doesn't lose a whole lot of sleep over that.
Do you understand how what's happened to these three women is wrong?
Yeah. Yet when I asked Anastasia, why did you lie? Why couldn't she just have said, I'm sorry? I'm sure now I would have stopped. That would have been enough. I'll have bad bone in my body.
He likes to view himself, I think, as being a good person, even though all the evidence is to the contrary. And when that's questioned, he responds really angrily. He likes to kind of drink his own Kool-Aid. His Kool-Aid is, I'm a good person, and I'm the victim here.
A guilty verdict was handed down in the brutal murders of Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuzyk, and Natalie Warmadum that had so many warning signs.
Barutsky represented himself during
If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges. Sorry. Which one gets to be Mo?
Everyone is wondering what's happened. Of course, it's a small town, and you know, you just don't think things like this are going to happen here. And everyone's just concerned, and our hearts go out for the families.
Family members mill about as sheriff's deputies, the Division of Criminal Investigation, and Altoona Rescue Crew, and then Des Moines Crime Scene Mobile Command descend on the farmstead. Tonight, hope for a break in the case. Investigators want to find a red 1995 Chevy Tahoe. The sheriff's office believes a man named Russell Overland is driving this truck. The big question tonight, could Russell Overland explain what led investigators to spend much of the night digging in the elderly couple's backyard?
Russ, about when the last time you saw your folks, saw your dad and your stepmom?
Well, let's see. I'm pretty sure I talked with him Saturday because I carried some corn in the house.
Where you been living?
Just, well, since September, I've been staying at the camper at my dad's place.
Who else lives there?
Where?
At your dad's place.
Just my dad and my stepmom.
Overland's history is consistent with somebody who is displaying a parasitic lifestyle. He hasn't been able to hold down jobs consistently. He has not only employment instability because of his work performance, but because interpersonally, he doesn't seem mature enough to realize how you handle interactions with bosses. He's in his 50s living on his parents' property in a trailer that they own.
So you're saying on Sunday you didn't see your dad and Naomi at all that day?
No. I know they went to church because the car was gone.
You watch the news? Watch TV on the way down? You know, when you stop at the motel, I'm assuming you watch the news?
Just the weather, basically.
Your dad and your stepmom were found dead.
Really?
Yeah. What can you tell us about it?
I was kind of hoping to play dumb, but obviously playing dumb
isn't going to work
so far. You found them, the bodies, right?
The reaction of, really, is not a normal reaction to finding out your parents are dead. Even if he maintained he didn't kill them or tried to pretend that he didn't, that reaction is just, it's incredibly telling. The detective knows what's going on just from that.
He's sitting back in his chair, almost twiddling his thumbs. Then he asks the question, so you found them, or you found the bodies? So then he turns around to poking to see how much do they know. Someone with psychopathy, they like to control the situation. They want to slowly dispense the information they have because it will all be about them. It's going to make them work.
Where do you suppose we found him?
I know exactly where you found them.
Can you tell me where we found him?
In a cistern.
Can you tell me what happened?
I killed him. I hate my stepmom.
You do?
I honestly say that I can really, truly say that I hate her.
What about your dad?
She made me feel unwelcome in the house.
Why don't you tell us the details of how it happened?
I beat him to death with a baseball bat.
There's no remorse in what he describes. It's as if he's just giving the facts. It happened this way, almost if you were narrating what was on a video. It's sort of this commentary on his own actions that's really indifferent and detached.
I had enough. When I got back from church, I did it in the back porch.
Were you waiting for him to come home from church?
I was waiting for him. Naomi came in first. I was waiting by the deep freeze. She walked up and I came at her right away with the baseball bat. Anyway, Father came after that, came through the door and says, "What the hell's going on here?" And I didn't really have a good explanation for him. I hit her with it, probably 2 or 3 times. Then when Father said, "Well, you better go somewhere or get out of here," or whatever, he says, "I'm going to call 911. When he started to go through the door into the kitchen, I hit him from behind and took care of him.
How many times did you hit him?
Probably half a dozen. And I finished him off with a pillow. Smothered him.
Where's the pillow from?
Got it from their bed.
What'd you do after that?
Well, after it got, took a long time for it to kill my dad. I didn't realize it'd take that long to smother somebody. But,
how long do you think it took?
Half an hour? I don't know. I was really surprised. But then after I got done with him, I went back and I wailed on Mama some more. She wasn't completely dead.
How many times do you think you hit her altogether?
Dozen, 15, whatever.
Overland's description of a fairly gruesome crime and the amount of effort that it took for him to kill his stepmother and his father is, again, just very matter of fact. He's not fazed by the fact that he was violently involved in any kind of interaction with them. But the fact that he returned to his stepmother and then beat her the number of times that he did suggests that in that moment he lost control and the only emotions he was in touch with were his anger and rage towards her.
What'd you do after that, Russ?
There was a blade on the front of the loader that he used for pushing snow. I took that off, 2 bolts, used the loader, did Naomi first, put her in the well. Had a hard time getting Father out the other door.
Did you have them both in the loader or just her?
One at a time.
One at a time. Did her and then him?
Ladies first.
I think a lot of his odd attempts at humor are much more for his own enjoyment, the kind of in-jokes with himself, and less for the detectives. His ladies first, with a little bit of emotion, kind of a chuckle almost. That's concerning. It's callous. When we see emotion, it's dark.
I had a half, kind of, what I intended on doing was moving out of county, and I didn't know whether I'd be able to do it or not, but get my dad's checking account transferred to another bank, and then I was going to try and use his Social Security checks.
Okay.
Because I figured I could forge his name, you know. Naomi, I don't look like Naomi, but I do have her middle name. She writes like a serial killer.
She writes like one?
She has got a very poor penmanship.
Oh, yeah?
The statement that his stepmother wrote like a serial killer is another demonstration of a really glib attitude. On the one hand, glorifying his actions, and on the other hand, he's really reducing his stepmother's reputation and her existence down to something that justifies his behavior.
Russ, was there anything that Was the straw that broke the camel's back, or just Sunday morning you decided that was the day?
I have been thinking about doing her in for probably 4 years or better. I was not welcome in the house. She thought that I smelled. She had a note on the door that said remove shoes. But she basically made it clear to me that she thought that I was raised like a heathen, because the way she put it, she said to my dad several times, "Didn't your mother ever tell you to take your shoes off? You kids must have just run in the house filthy." I have a plastic tub, and I use that to pee in, and then I dump it in the morning when I get outside. But I'd put a shirt over the top of it to cover it or whatever. But she basically said that your bed sheets and your room smells like a rest area or an outhouse.
He's complaining that she's saying that it's making the place smell like an outhouse. Or the simple fact to ask him to take shoes off coming into the house. This is enraging to him. We think that those kinds of things reflect a very, very fragile ego on the person's part. They feel insulted very easily because he thinks what he's doing is just fine.
I'm in trouble with credit cards, and they were going after my dad's property because he had my name on the will that I would inherit it. So they were going to put a lien against it. So that made my dad mad, and he had to end up paying $6,500 to settle that bill. So that's another reason that I'm sure that Naomi hated me, because I was a bum. But I am a bum. I've been living off my dad. Really I've been staying in a camper at my dad's place, but it's poor living, if you want to call it that.
He owns the phrase, "I'm a bum." There's some kind of self-loathing there that he's in the circumstances he's in. I'm wondering how much that financial reality is what kind of catalyzed it happening when it happened. Because suddenly he couldn't just cruise maybe the way he had.
Between the low self-esteem from my dad and the negative feelings, feedback I'm getting from her, I truly say that I don't miss either one. I realize what I've done is bad, but to me, it's a camel or a straw that broke a camel's back. She just basically made me feel as unwelcome as the plague.
Sounds like this is kind of building up over a period of time then.
It has. I have been literally thinking about it for at least 4 years. Because if I want to admit to it, I think I truly hate her.
Okay. You're being honest, it sounds like.
Russ, did anybody talk you into doing this to your dad and stepmom?
My own idea.
Did it on your own?
My first, long time ago, I was thinking about smothering them in bed when they're asleep. But I didn't really know how effective it would be, doing them both at the same time. So then my next thought was to get them while they're both watching Wheel of Fortune. In my way of thinking, I didn't think that I could do them separately. I might be able to do Father first and then Naomi. But I thought if I took her out of the picture first, I'd have to do Father.
Overland's planning is somewhat half-baked. He doesn't really think through the logistics of how he's going to live on the run. He spends 4 years lying in wait in his head, trying to plot out the perfect way to get rid of them. But even there, you hear this lack of effort. He didn't want to have to struggle to do it. And then ultimately, he decides on a Sunday, while they're at church, that that's the day he's going to do it, and he lays in wait for them to come home and then bludgeons them both to death.
simple logistics or whatever, try to do the most effective job. I was going to do her 2 weeks ago with the axe. I thought, well, now I ain't sure how effective a baseball bat would be. You know, solid. One good whack. Not that I'm trying to be Lizzie Borden.
Lizzie Borden is a well-known case of a woman who in the 1890s killed her own father and stepmother and stood trial for that. And the fact that Overland chooses to draw that parallel, I think, speaks to his own ego. He's proud of what he's done. This is somewhat self-aggrandizing. He's making himself important. He's making himself elevated in terms of his status.
But I did dump Naomi in the well. She was still alive. And to me, that gave me great pleasure. She was still struggling. She was still semi-conscious. She wasn't dead yet. Did she say anything? Not that I recall. Kind of groaning or whatever. She went head first? Yeah, head first. In fact, I had a little trouble getting her arms, because her arms kind of butterfly pattern, so I had to kind of play with her a little bit to get her right arm to go down. But plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is.
The idea of being thrown into a well while you're still alive, horror movies are made on the topic. It's something that most people have a very strong emotional reaction to. He's talking about how much joy he took from it. That's some impressive sadism.
I suppose I should be more remorseful. I have mildly thought several times of suicide, but I'm too chicken to try anything. I thought about hanging myself in the barn several times, but I'm too scared to do it. I thought, I've seen it on movies, I don't know if it actually worked, but I thought if you toss a radio in the bathtub, would it actually kill you? I think it would if you was in a tub full of water, but I'm not real sure.
I think you could probably get the job done that way.
When he's talking about suicide, I don't think he's describing so much depression, but he's describing feeling rejected from the entire world and not having a place in it. He's probably spent a lot of his life feeling horrible. Horrible and judged and not appreciated and entitled and not getting attention or acknowledgement.
Basically, the reason I don't seriously contemplate getting rid of myself, I figured I'd have my heart attack before now, but hasn't happened. And I think I'm in fairly reasonably good health. I can't seem to find a job that I like. I'm basically alone in the world, except for the folks. And I'm taking care of them. I'm not close with any of my siblings. Not real close. You look sadder than I do.
Him telling police that they look sadder than he does, I think actually shows some insight. It shows a little bit of awareness and willingness to say, yeah, I'm not motivated by the same things most people are. I thought I'd be dead by now. I'm still here. And he doesn't really want to continue to live. He doesn't get anything out of this life. Instead of getting busy living, he's waiting to die.
If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges. Sorry. Which one gets to be mom?
He is the center of attention. And for him, that's got to be satisfying, because this might be...
May 21st, 1969. Before the sun had fully climbed above the trees of central Connecticut, a narrow stretch of marshland lay almost perfectly still. The water barely moved. Thin reeds bent gently beneath a cool morning breeze, and a layer of mist floated low across the swamp as if trying to hide everything beneath it. From a distance, the landscape looked untouched, almost peaceful. There were no crowds, no police lights, no frantic voices breaking the silence. Just birds calling somewhere beyond the trees and the faint sound of water brushing against tangled grass. It was the kind of place people rarely visited unless they had a reason. On that morning, someone did. Hidden among the reeds lay the body of a 19-year-old man. His name was Alex Rackley. His hands still carried the marks of restraint. His body told a story that no witness had been willing to tell completely. Bruises darkened his skin. Burn marks hinted at hours of unimaginable suffering before death finally arrived. He had not died in a moment of sudden violence. His final hours had been measured not in minutes, but in waves of fear, pain, and unanswered questions. Whoever had brought him to this isolated place had wanted more than his death. They had wanted a confession. They had wanted certainty. Instead, they left behind one of the most disturbing murder cases in the history of America's political movements. For decades, this case has often been reduced to a headline. A young member of the Black Panther Party was murdered by members of his own organization after being accused of informing for the authorities. But headlines rarely capture the weight of human tragedy. They cannot describe what it feels like when loyalty becomes suspicion, when trust dissolves into fear, or when a movement born from hope begins to consume itself from within. The murder of Alex Rackley was never simply about one young man. It became a collision between revolution and paranoia, between justice and vengeance, between truth and rumors powerful enough to kill. To understand how Alex Rackley ended up abandoned in a Connecticut swamp, it is necessary to step into America during one of the most volatile years in its modern history. The late 1960s were filled with anger that seemed to echo from every street corner. Cities burned after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The Vietnam War divided families across the country. Young Americans marched against the government while others believed the nation itself was under attack from forces determined to tear it apart. Every institution appeared to be losing public trust. Protest was no longer unusual. It had become part of everyday life. Among the organizations rising from that atmosphere was the Black Panther Party. To some communities, its members represented courage, dignity, and resistance against police brutality. They organized breakfast programs for children, health clinics, and neighborhood patrols. They spoke openly about racial injustice and demanded change that many believed had been delayed for generations. To supporters, they were protectors. To critics, they were dangerous radicals. To the federal government, they quickly became something else entirely, a growing political force that demanded constant surveillance. The relationship between the Black Panther Party and law enforcement had become increasingly hostile. Raids, arrests, and deadly confrontations were becoming more common. Across the country, stories spread about informants hiding inside activist organizations. Every unexpected arrest, every failed operation, every police raid fueled another question. Who had talked? Who could still be trusted? Sometimes those suspicions were justified. Sometimes they were not. But once fear entered the room, facts often struggled to keep up. Inside organizations under pressure, suspicion has a unique way of growing. It rarely announces itself loudly. It begins with whispers. Someone notices an unfamiliar face. Someone remembers an odd conversation. Someone wonders why police arrived so quickly after a private meeting. One rumor becomes another. Small doubts become accepted truths without anyone realizing exactly when the evidence disappeared and assumptions took its place. In environments where betrayal carries deadly consequences, certainty becomes less important than survival. Some historians argue that this climate was intensified by federal intelligence operations aimed at disrupting political organizations. Others emphasize that internal conflicts already existed long before outside pressure reached its peak. Both realities can exist at the same time. A movement fighting external enemies can slowly become vulnerable to enemies imagined within its own walls. The result is a dangerous cycle where fear begins making decisions that reason no longer can. Alex Rackley entered that world while still barely out of childhood. At 19 years old, he was younger than many people imagine when they first hear this story. 19 is an age often associated with college classrooms, first jobs, uncertain dreams, and plans that stretch far into the future. Yet in America during 1969, 19 could also mean standing in the middle of political battles far larger than yourself. It could mean believing deeply in a cause. It could mean carrying hope alongside fear every single day. What happened to Alex during the final hours of his life remains deeply disturbing even after decades of investigation. Evidence presented later in court revealed that he was held inside a Black Panther headquarters in New Haven. There, according to testimony, he endured repeated beatings. He was questioned again and again about whether he had been working as an informant. His answers failed to satisfy those surrounding him. Pain became another method of interrogation. Violence became another question. Every denial seemed only to strengthen the belief that he was lying. It is difficult to imagine the emotional landscape inside that building during those hours. Outside, ordinary life continued. Cars passed through city streets. Families ate dinner. Children played on sidewalks. Yet inside those walls, suspicion had become stronger than friendship, stronger than shared ideals, stronger even than the possibility that they might be making a terrible mistake. Fear had narrowed every available choice until violence appeared, to some, as the only remaining answer. No murder begins with the pulling of a trigger. It begins much earlier. It begins with decisions that seem small at first. One accusation left unchallenged. One rumor repeated often enough to sound like fact. One leader convinced that hesitation could endanger everyone else. By the time Alex Rackley was driven away from New Haven toward the isolated marshland in Middlefield, countless opportunities to choose another path had already disappeared behind them. The road leading out of the city grew quieter with every passing mile. Buildings slowly gave way to forests. Traffic became scarce. The farther they traveled, the fewer witnesses remained. Dawn approached as the vehicle carried both the living and a decision that had already been made long before reaching its destination. Somewhere ahead waited a patch of swamp where the silence would eventually outlive every voice inside that car. Years later, investigators, historians, journalists, and former members would all attempt to reconstruct those final moments. Courtrooms would fill with testimony. Political leaders would face prosecution. National headlines would transform a local homicide into one of the most controversial criminal cases connected to the Black Panther Party. Yet even after thousands of pages of legal records and decades of historical analysis, one haunting truth remains impossible to escape. Before Alex Rackley became evidence, before he became a symbol, before his name entered history books, he was simply a frightened 19-year-old whose last hours unfolded in the shadow of fear powerful enough to convince ordinary people that killing one of their own was an act of necessity. That belief, whether born from genuine terror, manipulation, misplaced loyalty, or a combination of all three, would leave behind consequences reaching far beyond a lonely Connecticut swamp, forever changing not only the lives of everyone directly involved, but also the public image of one of the most influential political movements in American history. There is a haunting truth that echoes through nearly every notorious true crime case. The most devastating acts of violence are often preceded not by chaos, but by conviction. Someone becomes absolutely certain that they are right. Doubt disappears. Questions stop being asked. The humanity of another person slowly fades beneath labels, accusations, and fear. Once that happens, the line between justice and murder can vanish with terrifying speed. In the spring of 1969, America was living through a season where certainty had become a dangerous currency. The country felt as though it were being pulled apart from every direction. Every evening television broadcast seemed to deliver another image of unrest. Demonstrators filled the streets demanding an end to the Vietnam War. Civil rights activists continued fighting for promises that many believed had never truly been fulfilled. Police departments found themselves under increasing scrutiny. Government agencies expanded surveillance in the name of national security. Across the nation, people chose sides, and once those sides were chosen, trust became increasingly rare. For organizations challenging the existing political order, trust was not simply an emotional bond. It was survival itself. Every meeting carried risk. Every new recruit raised questions. Every unfamiliar face invited suspicion. The fear of infiltration was not imaginary. Informants had existed inside political organizations before. Law enforcement agencies had successfully gathered intelligence through confidential sources for years. Stories traveled quickly from city to city. A local chapter would hear about arrests hundreds of miles away and immediately wonder whether someone inside had spoken. Rumors moved faster than evidence ever could. Sometimes they were accurate. Often they were exaggerated. Yet in an atmosphere built on confrontation, the distinction between truth and rumor became increasingly difficult to recognize. The Black Panther Party stood at the center of that storm. Founded only a few years earlier, the organization had grown rapidly. Young men and women joined because they believed change could no longer wait. They organized community breakfast programs so children could begin school with full stomachs. They opened free medical clinics in neighborhoods that had long been neglected. They educated residents about their legal rights during encounters with police. They spoke openly about racial inequality and demanded accountability from institutions many believed had failed Black communities for generations. These efforts earned admiration from many residents. They also attracted intense attention from authorities. As confrontations increased across the country, newspapers often focused on images of armed panthers standing outside government buildings or marching through city streets. Those photographs became symbols that meant very different things depending on who was looking at them. To supporters, they represented dignity and self-defense. To critics, they suggested revolution and violence. To federal investigators, they represented an organization that demanded constant monitoring. Pressure built from every direction. Members feared arrest. Families feared retaliation. Leaders feared infiltration. Under those conditions, fear itself became another member of every meeting. It entered quietly. It sat in every corner. It whispered questions that nobody could answer with complete confidence. Who talked? Who disappeared after last week's meeting? Why did police arrive so quickly? Who knew the address? Who mentioned the plan outside the organization? Every coincidence acquired meaning. Every mistake invited suspicion. Every unanswered question demanded someone to blame. History repeatedly demonstrates that organizations facing intense outside pressure often become vulnerable to internal fractures. Those fractures rarely begin with violence. They begin with uncertainty. Once uncertainty mixes with exhaustion, anger, and constant external threats, ordinary disagreements can evolve into accusations carrying life or death consequences. Alex Rackley entered this environment while still trying to define who he was. 19 years old. An age filled with possibility. Old enough to carry adult responsibilities. Young enough to believe that conviction alone could change the world. There are surprisingly few detailed personal records describing Alex's private life compared with the enormous attention later given to his death. That absence creates its own sadness. When people become victims in infamous crimes, history sometimes remembers only the final chapter. Their dreams disappear beneath courtroom transcripts. Their personalities become footnotes beneath legal arguments. Their lives shrink into evidence exhibits. Yet Alex had existed long before prosecutors ever spoke his name. He laughed. He worried. He made ordinary decisions that never appeared in newspaper headlines. He joined conversations about politics, justice, and the future at a time when millions of young Americans believed history was unfolding directly around them. No one imagines that the people standing beside them in meetings today might someday become the people deciding whether they deserve to live tomorrow. That transformation rarely happens overnight. It happens gradually. A suspicious glance. An uncomfortable silence after someone enters a room. Private conversations ending the moment one particular person approaches. Questions repeated just a little too often. Eventually, the accused notices the distance before anyone else admits it exists. By May of 1969, according to testimony presented later during the investigation, suspicion surrounding Alex Rackley had intensified. Some members of the New Haven chapter became convinced that he had provided information to authorities. Whether those suspicions were supported by reliable evidence has remained the subject of historical debate for decades. What is clear is that belief alone proved powerful enough to set horrifying events into motion. Belief can become more dangerous than fact when enough people share it. Inside a tightly connected organization operating under extraordinary pressure, disagreement itself can begin to look suspicious. Defending an accused person may appear almost as dangerous as being accused. Silence becomes self-protection. Fear rewards obedience. Imagine the atmosphere inside the headquarters during those final hours. The windows separate two entirely different worlds. Outside, traffic moves through New Haven as it always has. Students hurry across sidewalks. Store owners unlock their doors. The city breathes normally. Inside, time slows. Every face searches another for certainty. Every answer seems incomplete. Every denial sounds rehearsed to ears already convinced of betrayal. Some people later described the questioning as an effort to uncover the truth. Others described it as torture from the very beginning. Court testimony established that Alex was restrained and repeatedly assaulted over many hours. Witnesses recounted brutal treatment intended to force a confession. Those details would later become central evidence during one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings connected to the Black Panther Party. Pain has a terrible way of reshaping time. Minutes stretch endlessly. Hope rises and collapses over and over again. The human mind searches desperately for signs that suffering will stop. Sometimes it never does. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this case is not simply that violence occurred, but that it unfolded among people who believed they were protecting something larger than themselves. History contains countless examples where individuals convinced themselves that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary cruelty. Once that reasoning takes hold, compassion becomes increasingly difficult to hear above the noise of fear. Nobody inside that building could see the future waiting beyond those walls. They could not see the investigators who would soon reconstruct every movement. They could not see reporters gathering outside courthouses. They could not see the televised hearings, the national controversy, the divided public opinion, or the decades of historical debate that would follow. In that moment, there was only the accusation. Only the interrogation. Only the growing belief that there could be no turning back. And yet, there is almost always a moment before irreversible violence when another choice still exists. Someone could open a door. Someone could refuse an order. Someone could insist on evidence instead of assumption. Someone could remember that suspicion is not proof. Whether that moment lasted seconds or hours, it eventually disappeared. When it did, Alex Rackley's fate became tied to a decision that would reverberate far beyond a single chapter of the Black Panther Party. His death would become more than a homicide investigation. It would become a mirror reflecting the immense pressures, fears, and contradictions of an America already struggling to define itself. The body discovered in a quiet Connecticut marsh would force an entire nation to confront an unsettling question. When fear becomes powerful enough to erase trust, how long does it take before a movement dedicated to fighting injustice begins committing its own? The story of Alex Rackley does not begin in the marsh where his body was found, nor does it begin inside the New Haven headquarters where he spent the final hours of his life. It begins much earlier, in a country where every passing month seemed to raise the temperature of an already boiling political climate. By 1969, violence had become so common in the headlines that many Americans had grown numb to it. Assassinations, riots, bomb threats, police raids, anti-war demonstrations, and armed confrontations were no longer isolated events. They had become the backdrop of daily life. For millions of people, waking up each morning meant wondering what new crisis would unfold before nightfall. The United States was experiencing more than political disagreement. It was experiencing a profound crisis of trust. Citizens questioned their government. Communities questioned the police. Young people questioned the future they had inherited. Government agencies questioned nearly every organization that challenged the established order. In return, Those organizations questioned everyone around them. Fear traveled in every direction. Against that backdrop, the death of a 19-year-old activist would become far more than a criminal investigation. It would become a symbol. To some, it represented the tragic consequences of internal extremism. To others, it illustrated the devastating psychological pressure created by constant surveillance and infiltration. To many historians, it revealed that the boundaries between victim and perpetrator, between ideology and violence, could become frighteningly blurred when fear overwhelmed reason. That is what makes this case endure. It is not remembered simply because a young man was murdered. Sadly, history contains countless murders. This case remains because almost every person involved believed they were acting inside a larger struggle, one that reached beyond themselves. Each decision was made in the shadow of politics, loyalty, suspicion, and survival. Those forces do not excuse what happened. But they help explain how events reached such a devastating conclusion. True crime often encourages us to search immediately for monsters. Someone obviously evil. Someone entirely without conscience. Someone easily separated from the rest of society. Reality is rarely that simple. The most unsettling cases are often those where ordinary human emotions become distorted under extraordinary pressure. Fear becomes certainty. Loyalty becomes obedience. Conviction becomes justification. Once those transformations occur, actions that once seemed unimaginable begin to feel, to the people committing them, almost inevitable. That possibility is deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to ask questions about human nature that have no easy answers. Could any tightly connected group begin turning against itself if enough fear were introduced? How much evidence do people truly require before believing an accusation? How quickly can compassion disappear once survival feels threatened? These questions remain painfully relevant decades after Alex Rackley's death because they extend far beyond one political movement or one historical period. They speak to something universal about the human mind. Psychologists have long observed that fear narrows perception. Under extreme stress, people become more likely to interpret ambiguous information as threatening. Neutral behavior begins to appear suspicious. Coincidences seem meaningful. Doubt feels dangerous because uncertainty itself becomes emotionally unbearable. In environments where betrayal could carry catastrophic consequences, the desire for certainty can become stronger than the desire for truth. That psychological shift would cast a long shadow over everything that happened in New Haven during May of 1969. Long before prosecutors presented evidence inside crowded courtrooms. Long before newspaper photographers gathered outside the courthouse. Long before historians debated responsibility. There was simply a room filled with anxious people trying to determine whether one of their own had become an enemy. No recording captured those conversations. No camera documented every expression. No transcript preserved every silence. History can reconstruct many events. It cannot fully recreate the emotions that filled that room. What investigators would eventually uncover came through physical evidence, witness testimony, and statements made by those involved. Each account revealed pieces of a larger picture, yet even together they could not answer every question. Memory is imperfect. Fear changes recollection. Self-preservation influences testimony. Every participant carried personal motives that investigators had to evaluate carefully. That uncertainty has followed this case ever since. Even today, historians continue examining newly available records, comparing testimonies, and debating the extent to which external pressures influenced internal decisions. While many aspects of the broader historical context remain subjects of scholarly discussion, one fact has never been disputed. Alex Rackley died after being subjected to prolonged abuse by fellow members of the organization he had joined. That reality remains the fixed point around which every other debate revolves. There is another reason this case continues to resonate. Unlike many infamous murders driven by greed, jealousy, or personal revenge, this crime emerged from a belief that it served a greater purpose. Throughout history, some of humanity's darkest acts have been committed not for personal gain but because individuals convinced themselves they were protecting a cause, a nation, a religion, or a movement. Once violence is reframed as necessity, moral boundaries can erode with alarming speed. Perhaps that is why the story feels so unsettling. There is no dramatic masked stranger emerging from the darkness. No mysterious serial killer stalking anonymous victims. No elaborate criminal conspiracy designed purely for profit. Instead, there are people who knew one another. People who attended meetings together. People who shared meals. People who spoke about justice. People who believed they were working toward a better future. Somewhere along that journey, fear became stronger than trust. The consequences would echo across the country. Within weeks, the murder investigation would attract national attention. Prosecutors would pursue charges against several individuals directly connected to the killing. The legal proceedings would eventually draw one of the Black Panther Party's most prominent national leaders into the courtroom, transforming an already shocking homicide into a highly publicized political controversy. Demonstrators would gather outside. Reporters would file stories across the nation. Every new development would deepen existing divisions over race, policing, activism, and government power. Yet before any of that unfolded, before courtrooms filled, before verdicts were delivered, before history assigned meaning to every decision, there was only one undeniable reality. A 19-year-old man disappeared into the final night of his life, surrounded not by strangers, but by people he believed were on the same side. That contradiction lies at the heart of this story. It is a story about murder, but it is equally a story about trust. About fear. About ideology. About the terrible cost of allowing certainty to replace evidence. Over the next chapters, we will follow the events that led Alex Rackley from an ordinary young activist into the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases of the late 1960s. We will examine the people involved, the investigation that unraveled their actions, the courtroom battles that divided public opinion, and the lasting historical impact of a killing that continues to provoke difficult conversations more than half a century later. Because this is not merely the story of how Alex Rackley died. It is the story of how a movement fighting against oppression became consumed, for one irreversible moment, by fear from within, and how the consequences of that single decision would outlive nearly everyone who stood in that room. By the time the calendar turned to 1969, New Haven, Connecticut, was a city of contradictions. Its streets carried the weight of centuries of American history while simultaneously standing at the edge of a rapidly changing future. Elegant brick buildings stood only a few blocks away from neighborhoods burdened by poverty. Ivy-covered walls surrounded one of the world's most prestigious universities, while working-class families struggled to make rent in aging apartment buildings where the paint peeled from the walls and the sound of sirens was becoming an increasingly familiar part of the night. The city was not unique in that respect. Across the United States, communities were wrestling with the same tensions, but in New Haven those contrasts existed side by side, making every political argument feel intensely personal. On a warm afternoon, downtown sidewalks bustled with students carrying stacks of books beneath their arms. Professors hurried toward lectures. Office workers slipped into diners for a quick lunch before returning to their desks. City buses rumbled past storefront windows reflecting the afternoon sun. At first glance, life appeared ordinary, almost calm. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm flowed a current of anxiety that was difficult to ignore. Every newspaper seemed to bring another story about demonstrations somewhere in the country. Every radio bulletin spoke of protests, arrests, or clashes between activists and police. Television broadcasts delivered images of soldiers fighting thousands of miles away in Vietnam while, back at home, crowds gathered in American cities demanding that the war come to an end. For many people, the nation no longer felt stable. It felt as though it were holding its breath. Race remained one of the deepest fault lines running through American society. Although landmark civil rights legislation had been passed only a few years earlier, legal victories had not erased generations of inequality. Many black neighborhoods continued to experience high unemployment, inadequate housing, underfunded schools, and frequent confrontations with law enforcement. Promises of equality often seemed far removed from everyday reality. Frustration grew not because people expected instant change, but because they believed change was arriving far too slowly. Within that atmosphere, the Black Panther Party found an audience among young people searching for something more direct than speeches and promises. The organization projected confidence, discipline, self-reliance. Its members often appeared in black leather jackets and berets, creating an image that newspapers could never resist photographing. Yet the public image captured only part of the story. While critics focused on armed patrols and revolutionary rhetoric, many local chapters devoted enormous energy to community programs. Volunteers prepared free breakfasts before sunrise so neighborhood children could begin school without hunger distracting them. Medical clinics provided basic health care to families who had long struggled to access it. Educational initiatives encouraged political awareness and community involvement. To supporters living in neglected neighborhoods, these programs represented practical help rather than political theater. To opponents, however, every act of community organization carried the potential for broader political influence. That tension defined almost every conversation surrounding the movement. The New Haven chapter reflected those same contradictions. Meetings often stretched late into the evening. Volunteers planned food distributions, discussed neighborhood concerns, debated national events, and tried to balance idealism with the realities of operating under constant scrutiny. New members arrived carrying different backgrounds, different personalities, and different expectations. Some had grown up facing discrimination that shaped every aspect of their worldview. Others were college students drawn by political conviction. Some sought social change. Others sought belonging. Many sought both. For someone entering the organization, the sense of purpose could feel overwhelming in the best possible way. There were always people talking. Always plans being made. Always another project needing volunteers. Always another discussion about how to improve conditions in the community. Energy filled every room. So did pressure. Because behind every public activity lingered another unavoidable reality. The organization believed it was being watched. Sometimes that belief proved accurate. Federal and local law enforcement agencies maintained significant interest in political organizations across the country, including the Black Panther Party. Government surveillance, confidential informants, and intelligence gathering were genuine features of that historical period. The extent, methods, and consequences of those operations have been studied extensively by historians for decades. Their existence contributed to an atmosphere in which members frequently worried that conversations taking place behind closed doors might eventually reach the authorities. Whether every fear was justified mattered less than the fact that people believed it could happen. Psychologically, that distinction is crucial. Human behavior is shaped not only by reality but by perceived reality. If individuals genuinely believe someone nearby may be reporting their activities, they begin interpreting ordinary behavior differently. Silence becomes suspicious. Curiosity becomes suspicious. Mistakes become suspicious. Even nervousness itself becomes suspicious. Once those interpretations begin accumulating, they reinforce one another until doubt feels almost impossible to challenge. Inside the New Haven chapter, maintaining unity became increasingly important. Discipline was emphasized. Commitment mattered. Reliability mattered even more. Members depended upon one another not simply for friendship but for safety. Every meeting carried an implicit understanding that trust was essential. If trust failed, everything else could collapse with it. That responsibility weighed especially heavily upon local leaders. They were expected to organize community initiatives while simultaneously protecting members from perceived external threats. Every unexpected arrest prompted questions. Every police action invited speculation about leaked information. Every operational setback encouraged someone to wonder whether an informant had been involved. Such concerns were not unique to New Haven. They echoed through activist organizations across the country. Sometimes they reflected legitimate security risks. Other times they reflected fear feeding upon itself. The distinction was not always obvious in the moment. Looking back with decades of historical distance, it is tempting to imagine that wiser decisions should have been easy. History often creates that illusion. We know how stories end. The people living through them do not. They make decisions with incomplete information, emotional pressure, and uncertain consequences. That does not excuse harmful actions, but it reminds us that historical events unfold through human perception rather than hindsight. Spring settled gently across Connecticut during those weeks. Trees regained their leaves after the long winter. Afternoon sunlight lingered later each evening. The air carried the scent of damp soil after occasional rain showers rolled through the city. Children played outside until streetlights flickered on. Couples walked beneath budding branches without realizing that one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern political history was quietly approaching. Nothing about the city itself suggested that national headlines were only days away. No visible warning appeared. No dramatic signs announced what would soon happen. Life continued through its ordinary routines. Grocery stores opened each morning. Factories changed shifts. Church bells rang on Sunday. Neighbors greeted one another across apartment hallways. The ordinary nature of those days makes the coming tragedy even more unsettling. Because catastrophic events rarely announce themselves. They develop quietly beneath everyday life. A rumor begins. A misunderstanding grows. An accusation spreads through private conversations. Each individual step appears manageable until someone suddenly realizes that there is no safe path backward. Within the New Haven chapter, conversations increasingly revolved around security. Members understood that organizations engaged in political activism often attracted unwanted attention. Stories circulated from other cities describing arrests and alleged infiltrations. Whether every account proved accurate hardly mattered. Their cumulative effect shaped behavior. People listened more carefully. They spoke more cautiously. They watched one another just a little more closely than before. Fear does not need constant evidence to survive. It only needs occasional reinforcement. Every confirmed example strengthens countless unconfirmed suspicions. That psychological environment formed the backdrop against which Alex Rackley's final days unfolded. He was not entering a peaceful organization untouched by outside conflict. Nor was he entering a simple criminal enterprise. He was stepping into a movement filled with passionate idealists, committed volunteers, political tension, genuine external pressure, internal disagreements, and growing anxiety over whom to trust. Those competing realities existed simultaneously. Understanding them does not diminish the horror of what eventually occurred. Instead, they explain why a tragedy that seems incomprehensible from a distance gradually became possible to the people living inside that moment. Before anyone raised a hand against Alex Rackley, before accusations hardened into certainty, before a single act of violence was committed, the stage had already been set by a city, a nation, and an era where fear had become so common that it quietly settled into everyday life. Waiting for the moment when it would demand a terrible price. If an outsider had walked through New Haven in May of 1969, they might have struggled to understand why so many people spoke in lowered voices whenever politics entered the conversation. The city itself was not a battlefield. There were no tanks rolling through the streets. No curfews keeping families locked inside their homes every night. Children still rode bicycles along neighborhood sidewalks. Shop owners swept the fronts of their businesses before opening for the day. Church congregations gathered on Sundays as they always had. From a distance, life retained its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath that rhythm, tension was everywhere. It lingered in conversations between neighbors. It surfaced during city council meetings. It appeared in classrooms, churches, union halls, and family dinner tables. People no longer argued only about taxes or local elections. They argued about the future of the country itself. For many young Americans, especially those who had come of age during the civil rights movement, patience was beginning to feel like surrender. They had watched peaceful demonstrations met with violence. They had seen images of police dogs, fire hoses, arrests, and assassinations broadcast across the nation. The optimism that had inspired so many earlier in the decade was increasingly colliding with frustration. Change had come, but not nearly fast enough for those who continued to experience discrimination in their daily lives. That frustration shaped an entire generation. Some chose peaceful protest. Others pursued political organizing. Some entered government hoping to reform institutions from within. Others concluded that existing institutions had little interest in reform at all. The Black Panther Party emerged within that broader landscape, offering a message that combined community service with a willingness to confront authority more directly than many other civil rights organizations. To supporters, this approach reflected necessity rather than aggression. They believed communities had the right to protect themselves, educate themselves, and care for one another when existing systems failed to do so. This distinction is important because history often compresses complicated organizations into simple stereotypes. The reality was more layered. A single chapter could spend the morning preparing breakfasts for neighborhood children and the afternoon discussing security concerns. Members might organize health screenings one day and attend tense political meetings the next. Acts of compassion and acts of confrontation existed within the same movement. That complexity helps explain why emotions surrounding the organization were so deeply divided. To admirers, the Panthers represented courage. To critics, they represented danger. To many members, they represented family. Family is an appropriate word because movements built around shared sacrifice often create relationships stronger than ordinary friendships. People spend long hours together. They share meals, responsibilities, risks, disappointments, and victories. They celebrate small successes and endure setbacks side by side. Gradually, the organization becomes more than a political commitment. It becomes a source of identity. Identity can be a powerful force. It offers purpose. It creates belonging. But it can also create pressure. Within close-knit groups, disagreement may begin to feel like betrayal. Questions can be mistaken for disloyalty. Independent thinking may be interpreted as weakness. When external threats increase, internal conformity often becomes stronger. That pattern has appeared throughout history in political movements, military organizations, religious groups, and even corporations under intense pressure. Human beings naturally seek certainty during uncertain times. Shared beliefs provide emotional security. Anyone perceived as threatening those beliefs may quickly become isolated. By the spring of 1969, the Black Panther Party faced pressures from multiple directions. Public attention continued to grow. Law enforcement agencies maintained close scrutiny of many chapters. Internal disagreements emerged over leadership, strategy, and priorities. Members in different cities confronted different challenges, yet one concern echoed almost everywhere: the possibility of informants. Even the word itself carried enormous weight. An informant was not merely someone who shared information. Within revolutionary movements, an informant represented broken trust, compromised safety, potential imprisonment. In the minds of some members, an informant could be directly responsible for police raids, arrests, or even deaths. Whether every accusation was accurate became almost secondary to the emotional power those accusations carried. Fear rarely waits for verification. Once suspicion entered a conversation, it changed the atmosphere immediately. People became careful about what they revealed. Meetings grew more guarded. Casual conversations lost some of their openness. The invisible wall between us and them became increasingly important. And sometimes, tragically, nobody knew with certainty who belonged on which side of that wall. The headquarters in New Haven reflected these pressures. People arrived throughout the day carrying news from other chapters. Some discussed upcoming community programs. Others analyzed newspaper articles about police activity. Leadership meetings could shift rapidly from practical planning to urgent conversations about security. Every unexpected event demanded interpretation. Why had someone failed to appear? Why had authorities acted so quickly? Why had confidential discussions somehow reached outside ears? In hindsight, Many of these questions had perfectly ordinary explanations. But hindsight was a luxury unavailable to those living through the moment. Instead, they interpreted events through the lens of constant vigilance. Psychologists sometimes describe this process as threat amplification. Under prolonged stress, the human brain becomes increasingly sensitive to possible danger. Evolutionarily, this response once helped human beings survive hostile environments. Missing a genuine threat carried greater consequences than reacting to a false alarm. However, in modern social settings, that same instinct can distort judgment. Innocent behavior begins appearing suspicious simply because people have become conditioned to expect betrayal. There is no evidence that everyone within the New Haven chapter shared identical beliefs or responded to pressure in the same way. Like any organization, it consisted of individuals with different personalities, experiences, and opinions. Some were cautious. Some were outspoken. Some favored restraint. Others believed stronger measures were necessary. Those differences would later become significant as investigators attempted to reconstruct exactly who participated in the decisions leading to Alex Rackley's death. For now, however, the chapter continued operating much as it always had. Community work remained important. Meetings continued. People laughed together. Arguments flared and faded. Meals were shared. Plans for future projects filled notebooks scattered across tables. Life moved forward. That ordinary routine makes what followed especially heartbreaking. Because tragedy seldom arrives wearing a recognizable face. It enters quietly. One conversation at a time. One assumption at a time. One decision at a time. Until suddenly ordinary life has become impossible to recognize. Somewhere inside those busy rooms sat a young man who, like everyone else, was navigating the uncertainty of an era defined by confrontation. Alex Rackley was not yet the center of a murder investigation. He was another member within a complicated organization, living through extraordinary times alongside people who believed they were engaged in a struggle much larger than themselves. None of them could know that within days, the New Haven chapter would become the focus of national attention. Reporters would descend upon the city. Courtrooms would fill with spectators. Political leaders, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and historians would spend years examining decisions made during those tense days in May. The name New Haven would become permanently linked with one of the most controversial criminal cases associated with the Black Panther Party. Yet history often begins in rooms that appear completely ordinary. A building where people gather. A table surrounded by familiar faces. Conversations that seem routine. No one notices the exact moment when fear becomes stronger than trust. No clock announces when suspicion crosses the invisible line into certainty. And by the time that line becomes visible, it is often already too late. In the days ahead, that invisible transformation would unfold inside the New Haven chapter with devastating consequences. What had begun as an atmosphere of vigilance would steadily evolve into something far more dangerous, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved and leave a permanent scar on the history of one of America's most influential political movements. As spring settled more firmly over Connecticut, the city seemed suspended between two different versions of America. One version appeared in glossy university brochures and postcards, where New Haven was presented as a center of education, tradition, and intellectual achievement. Visitors admired tree-lined streets, historic architecture, and the quiet confidence of an old New England city. Students hurried between lecture halls with notebooks tucked beneath their arms, believing that ideas could shape the future. Professors debated politics in crowded cafes. Libraries remained full long after sunset. From that perspective, New Haven looked like a place where the nation's next generation of leaders was being prepared. Just a few miles away, however, another reality unfolded. Families faced rising living costs. Employment opportunities remained limited for many Black residents. Entire neighborhoods carried the weight of decades of economic neglect. Children grew up watching opportunities exist close enough to see, yet often feel impossibly distant to reach. For them, Discussions about equality were not abstract political theories debated inside classrooms. They were questions that determined where people lived, how they were treated, whether they felt protected or threatened by the institutions around them. The contrast between these two worlds was impossible to ignore. Every day, people crossed invisible boundaries separating privilege from hardship. Some hardly noticed those boundaries. Others lived with them every waking hour. This divide created fertile ground for activism. Community organizations, churches, neighborhood leaders, and political movements all sought different answers to the same fundamental question: how could meaningful change be achieved in a society that remained deeply unequal despite years of reform? The Black Panther Party offered one answer. Not the only answer. Not an answer accepted by everyone, but one that resonated with many who believed gradual progress had failed to address immediate realities. The New Haven chapter reflected that urgency. Members were often young, energetic, and convinced that history demanded action rather than patience. Their headquarters served multiple purposes. It was a meeting place, an organizing center, and, for many, a second home. People came to discuss community projects, distribute responsibilities, exchange ideas, and spend time among others who shared similar hopes for the future. There were evenings when the building felt almost ordinary. Someone brewed coffee in a small kitchen. Stacks of pamphlets waited to be distributed. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as members gathered for another meeting. Laughter occasionally interrupted serious conversations. New volunteers introduced themselves with a mixture of enthusiasm and nervousness. The atmosphere could feel welcoming, purposeful, alive. Yet beneath that sense of purpose existed a constant awareness that the organization operated under extraordinary pressure. Every unfamiliar vehicle parked outside attracted attention. Every unexpected phone call raised questions. Every rumor arriving from another city seemed to carry a warning. People did not need evidence that they were living through turbulent times. The evidence surrounded them daily. Across the country, confrontations involving Black Panther chapters continued to make national headlines. Arrests, raids, and legal battles reinforced the belief that conflict with authorities was not merely possible but inevitable. Whether discussing events in Oakland, Chicago, Los Angeles, or elsewhere, members understood that what happened hundreds of miles away could influence attitudes inside their own chapter. Distance offered little comfort. News traveled quickly. Fear traveled even faster. Modern readers sometimes imagine that people living through history possess a clear understanding of the forces shaping their lives. In reality, they experience uncertainty just as we do today. They hear incomplete information. They encounter rumors mixed with facts. They interpret events through personal experiences and emotional pressures. Looking backward, historians can identify patterns that were invisible at the time. Those living through the moment could only respond to what they believed they knew. That uncertainty shaped daily life inside the New Haven chapter. Conversations often returned to security. Who had attended recent meetings? Who had missed them? Why had certain police actions unfolded the way they had? Could someone be passing information? The questions themselves were not unusual given the political climate. The danger arose when answers began arriving before evidence did. Human beings are remarkably skilled at connecting scattered pieces into coherent stories, even when important information is missing. The brain naturally searches for explanations because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Once an explanation begins to form, people often notice information that supports it while overlooking details that challenge it. Psychologists refer to this tendency as confirmation bias, and it can quietly influence decisions without anyone recognizing its presence. Inside a close-knit organization operating under stress, that bias can become especially powerful. If someone is already viewed with suspicion, ordinary actions may suddenly appear suspicious. A missed meeting. An awkward conversation. A nervous expression. None of these prove wrongdoing. Yet in an atmosphere dominated by fear, each may seem to reinforce an accusation that has yet to be substantiated. No organization is immune to this dynamic. Political movements, military units, religious communities, businesses under intense pressure. Whenever loyalty becomes central to survival, suspicion acquires extraordinary influence. This broader psychological landscape is essential to understanding what happened next. The murder of Alex Rackley did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a climate where external conflict, internal anxiety, ideological commitment, and fear of betrayal had gradually intertwined until separating one from another became almost impossible. That does not lessen personal responsibility. It does, however, illuminate how a sequence of decisions that appears incomprehensible from a distance became conceivable to those caught inside the moment. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the headquarters, everyday life continued with almost painful normality. Children waited for school buses. Factory whistles marked the beginning of another workday. Local diners filled with customers discussing baseball scores, rising prices, and neighborhood gossip. Rain showers came and went, leaving damp sidewalks that reflected the afternoon sun. The seasons moved forward without regard for the tensions quietly building behind closed doors. History often unfolds this way. The ordinary and the extraordinary exist side by side. One family celebrates a birthday while another prepares for a funeral. One neighborhood enjoys a peaceful afternoon while another becomes the scene of violence. Most people remain unaware that events destined for history books are developing only a few streets away. Within days, New Haven would no longer be simply another American city navigating the unrest of the late 1960s. It would become the setting for a case that drew national media attention, ignited fierce political debate, and left lasting questions about loyalty, fear, and justice. But at this point in the story, none of that had happened yet. There was still time for different choices. Time for questions to replace assumptions. Time for caution to overcome certainty. Time for humanity to prevail over fear. Those opportunities, fragile as they were, still existed. Soon, they would disappear one by one. And once they were gone, the consequences would extend far beyond a single building in New Haven, reaching courtrooms, newspaper front pages, and history itself. Before investigators would photograph evidence, before witnesses would testify under oath, and before juries would weigh responsibility, the city remained suspended in an uneasy calm. Unaware that one of the most consequential true crime stories connected to the Black Panther Party was only beginning to unfold. History remembers victims in curious ways. The more famous the crime becomes, the smaller the victim's life often appears. Newspaper headlines reduce an entire human existence to a single sentence. Court records replace childhood memories with exhibits and testimony. Decades later, people can recite the details of the murder while knowing almost nothing about the person who was murdered. In the case of Alex Rackley, that imbalance is especially striking. His name has become inseparable from one of the most controversial homicide cases connected to the Black Panther Party, yet the young man himself often fades into the background, overshadowed by politics, courtroom drama, and the larger historical debates that followed. Before he became evidence in a murder trial, Alex Rackley was simply a 19-year-old trying to find his place in an America that seemed to be changing faster than anyone could fully understand. 19. It is an age balanced between adolescence and adulthood. Old enough to believe that ideals matter. Young enough to imagine that courage alone can reshape the world. Most 19-year-olds spend their days thinking about school, work, friendships, romance, or the uncertain excitement of the future. They make plans without imagining that history might one day remember their names. They expect tomorrow to arrive much like today, offering another opportunity to grow, to make mistakes, and to begin again. Alex never received that opportunity. Compared with many victims whose lives have been documented in great detail, surprisingly little verified personal information survives about Alex Rackley. Historical records focus overwhelmingly on the investigation, the criminal proceedings, and the political consequences of his death. His private life exists mostly in fragments scattered throughout legal documents and contemporary reporting. Those fragments, though incomplete, reveal something important. He was not a famous national leader. He was not an experienced political strategist. He was not one of the public faces appearing on television broadcasts. He was a young member of a local chapter. One individual among many. That fact makes his story all the more heartbreaking. Movements are often remembered through their leaders. History books describe speeches, demonstrations, elections, and ideological struggles. Far less attention is given to the ordinary members who believed deeply enough to participate without ever expecting recognition. They distributed pamphlets, attended meetings, volunteered at community programs, and invested themselves in causes larger than their own lives. Alex appears to have been one of those people. Whether he joined because of political conviction, a desire for belonging, concern for racial justice, or a combination of many motivations, one reality remains clear. He chose to become part of something he believed mattered. For young people during the late 1960s, political engagement was not unusual. The nation itself seemed to demand participation. College campuses became centers of protest. Neighborhood organizations multiplied. Young Americans debated civil rights, war, policing, inequality, and the future with an intensity rarely seen in previous generations. Remaining completely detached from politics often felt impossible. Every newspaper, every television broadcast, every conversation seemed to ask the same question. What kind of country should America become? For some, the answer involved reform through existing institutions. For others, deeper structural change seemed necessary. The Black Panther Party attracted many young people who believed communities deserved not only equal treatment under the law but also practical support that governments had failed to provide. Free breakfast programs, community health initiatives, political education, and neighborhood organizing appealed to individuals who wanted immediate action rather than distant promises. It is entirely possible that Alex saw those efforts as meaningful. Many members certainly did. There is no reliable historical record preserving every private conversation he had, every dream he carried, or every reason behind his decisions. Responsible storytelling requires acknowledging those gaps rather than filling them with invented certainty. We cannot know exactly what he imagined for his future. But we do know this. No available historical evidence suggests that he expected to become the victim of those standing beside him. Trust is rarely discussed until it disappears. Within organizations built around common purpose, trust becomes almost invisible because it is assumed. People share information. They rely upon one another. They believe that disagreements will remain disagreements. That loyalty flows in both directions. When that trust is broken, the emotional impact extends far beyond the immediate betrayal. It shakes the very foundation upon which the group exists. Somewhere during his time with the New Haven chapter, Alex built relationships with fellow members. He attended meetings. He recognized familiar faces. He likely greeted many of the same people repeatedly. Perhaps they shared meals after long discussions. Perhaps they argued about strategy before laughing together only minutes later. Such ordinary interactions rarely appear in historical records because they seem unimportant at the time. Only afterward do they acquire heartbreaking significance. Imagine entering a room filled with people you believe are your allies. Imagine believing that everyone present shares the same broad hopes for justice and change. Imagine never considering that suspicion has already begun growing quietly behind your back. That possibility alone is enough to make this case profoundly tragic. Victims of violent crime often lose more than their lives. They lose the future they expected. The conversations they never finished. The birthdays they never celebrated. The careers they never built. The families they never started. Every homicide destroys not only a present life but an unwritten future. Alex Rackley's future ended before he reached his 20th birthday. He would never experience adulthood in the ordinary sense. Never watch the decades that followed. Never witness how historians, journalists, attorneys, and scholars would continue debating the circumstances surrounding his death for generations. Instead, his name became permanently attached to one horrifying chapter in American history. There is another painful dimension to his story. Unlike victims attacked by strangers, Alex appears to have remained among people he believed he knew until very near the end. That fact transforms the emotional landscape of the crime. Violence committed by strangers is terrifying. Violence committed within a trusted community carries an additional layer of betrayal that is difficult to describe. It forces us to reconsider every ordinary moment that came before. When did conversations begin changing? When did smiles become guarded? When did ordinary questions become hidden accusations? At what point did he realize something was terribly wrong? Those answers remain beyond the reach of history. What survives instead are the consequences. Looking back now, it is tempting to see Alex only through the lens of victimhood. Yet before tragedy entered his life, he occupied the same uncertain stage of adulthood experienced by countless young people. He lived during a remarkable era. He believed enough to participate. He became caught inside forces much larger than himself. And ultimately, he paid the highest possible price for suspicions that would alter not only his own destiny but the course of one of the most controversial criminal investigations of the late 1960s. Long before investigators examined evidence. Long before prosecutors assembled their case. Long before newspaper photographers crowded courthouse steps. There was simply a 19-year-old young man whose life still stretched ahead of him, filled with possibilities that history would never allow him to reach. In remembering Alex Rackley, it is essential not only to examine how he died, but also to recognize the humanity that existed before the crime, a humanity too often eclipsed by the political storm that followed his death. There is an unfortunate pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of true crime. The victim's final hours become endlessly examined, while the years that came before slowly disappear from public memory. Investigators reconstruct the crime scene with remarkable precision. Attorneys analyze testimony line by line. Historians debate motives, responsibility, and political consequences. Yet the victim, the very person whose life was taken, is often remembered only through the violence that ended it. Alex Rackley deserves to be remembered as more than the final chapter of his own story. Because before there was fear. Before there were accusations. Before there was a courtroom. There was simply a young man living through one of the most turbulent periods in modern American history. The late 1960s placed extraordinary expectations on young people. Many felt they had inherited a nation struggling with problems that older generations had failed to solve. Civil rights remained an urgent issue. The Vietnam War continued claiming lives overseas. Political assassinations had shaken public confidence. Every major institution seemed to be questioned by someone. For many 19-year-olds, choosing not to care about politics no longer felt like an option. Entire friendships revolved around ideas. University campuses became places where debates continued long after classrooms emptied. Community centers hosted discussions about equality, policing, education, and poverty. Every newspaper headline invited another argument. Every protest inspired another response. Young Americans searched for purpose in a country that seemed uncertain about its own identity. Some found that purpose through churches. Some through universities. Some through neighborhood organizations. Others through movements like the Black Panther Party. To understand why individuals joined such organizations, it is important to resist the temptation to see history only through hindsight. We already know how this story ends. Alex did not. Neither did most of the people around him. They were making decisions based on the information, hopes, and fears available to them at that moment. Joining a movement often begins with something surprisingly ordinary. A conversation. An invitation. A meeting attended out of curiosity. Someone says, "Come listen." Someone else says, "We're trying to help the community." Purpose rarely arrives dramatically. It grows. People return because they feel useful. Because they feel heard. Because they discover others who understand experiences that had previously seemed impossible to explain. For many young activists across America during that era, organizations provided something larger than politics alone. They provided identity. Belonging. Direction. Those emotional needs are deeply human. They are not unique to one generation or one movement. Psychologists have long observed that people naturally seek communities that affirm their values and give meaning to their efforts. Especially during periods of social instability, belonging becomes incredibly powerful. A shared mission can transform strangers into close companions within remarkably short periods of time. It is reasonable to believe that Alex experienced at least some of that sense of belonging. While the historical record does not preserve detailed personal reflections from him, it does show that he became involved with the New Haven chapter at a time when many young members genuinely believed they were contributing to meaningful social change. That belief mattered. Not because it explains what happened later, but because it reminds us that Alex entered the organization with expectations very different from the fate awaiting him. Nobody joins a community expecting to fear the people beside them. Nobody imagines that ordinary meetings could someday become scenes of unimaginable violence. Trust develops quietly. One conversation at a time. One shared responsibility. One familiar face becoming another. Eventually trust becomes so ordinary that people stop noticing it altogether. Only after it is shattered do they recognize how much of daily life depended upon it. The tragedy of Alex Rackley's story lies partly in that invisible trust. At some point, he likely greeted people whose names he knew. Shared ideas with them. Worked alongside them. Perhaps disagreed with them occasionally, as members of any organization do. Nothing in ordinary human relationships prepares someone for the possibility that suspicion may already be spreading behind closed doors. Suspicion is unusual because it rarely announces itself to the person being suspected. It grows privately. It circulates in conversations from which the accused is absent. Questions multiply. Interpretations shift. Neutral actions begin acquiring sinister explanations. By the time the accused becomes aware that something has changed, opinions may already have hardened. That process has repeated throughout history in countless different settings. Political movements, military organizations, religious communities, corporations, families. Whenever fear becomes stronger than communication, misunderstanding gains room to grow. We do not know the precise moment when Alex first sensed that attitudes toward him had begun to change. Perhaps he noticed subtle differences in conversation. Perhaps someone avoided eye contact. Perhaps meetings felt unusually tense. Or perhaps he remained completely unaware until events moved beyond the point of return. History cannot answer those questions honestly. And responsible storytelling must leave space for uncertainty where certainty does not exist. What we do know is that the accusations eventually directed toward Alex centered on the belief that he had become an informant. Within the climate of 1969, that accusation carried extraordinary consequences. To many activists, informing did not represent an ordinary disagreement. It represented betrayal capable of endangering an entire organization. Whether an accusation proved true or false became less important once enough people accepted it as fact. That psychological shift is one of the most dangerous dynamics found in group behavior. When a community collectively reaches certainty without sufficient evidence, dissent itself becomes risky. Anyone defending the accused may suddenly appear suspicious as well. Silence becomes self-protection. Fear encourages conformity. Critical thinking slowly retreats. Looking backward, it is easy to ask why someone did not intervene sooner. Why someone did not insist upon more evidence. Why someone did not simply walk away. Such questions are understandable. But history repeatedly shows that people operating inside highly stressful environments often experience events very differently from those observing decades later. Pressure narrows perspective. Urgency discourages reflection. Group consensus acquires tremendous influence. None of these realities excuse violence. They help explain how ordinary individuals can become participants in extraordinary tragedy. Alex Rackley never had the opportunity to tell his own story in full. His voice survives only indirectly through fragments preserved in legal proceedings and historical records. Everything else has been swallowed by time. Perhaps that is why remembering his humanity matters so much. Not because history requires another symbol, but because every victim deserves to be recognized as a complete person rather than merely the subject of a famous case. Before investigators documented his injuries, before attorneys debated testimony, before journalists transformed his death into national headlines, Alex Rackley was simply another young man trying to navigate a confusing and deeply divided America. Like countless others of his generation, he sought purpose during an era that demanded difficult choices. He could not have known that those choices would place him at the center of a tragedy that would echo through American history for decades, nor that his name would become forever linked not with the life he hoped to build, but with the violence that brought that life to an abrupt and heartbreaking end. The tragedy of Alex Rackley is not only found in the brutality of his final hours. It is also found in everything that disappeared with him. Every person carries a private world that exists beyond public records. Memories from childhood, conversations shared with friends, small victories that never make headlines, personal hopes that may seem insignificant to historians but mean everything to the person living them. When a life ends violently, that private world disappears with it. What remains are fragments. A name in a newspaper, a photograph, a court document, a sentence in a history book. For Alex Rackley, those fragments became the only pieces through which future generations would know him. Yet behind those fragments was a young man whose life was not defined by the political controversy that followed his death. He was defined by the fact that he was human. He had reached an age when many people are still discovering who they are. 19 years old is not an ending. It is usually a beginning. It is a time when the future feels uncertain but full of possibility. People at that age often believe they have endless time to change direction, to learn, to make mistakes, and to become someone different from who they are today. Alex never received those years. He never reached the stage of life where youthful beliefs mature into experience. He never had the chance to look back on the choices of his teenage years and decide what he still believed. He never had the chance to change his mind. That final point is especially important because the late 1960s were an era when many young people were still forming their identities. Political beliefs were not always fixed. People attended meetings, read new ideas, debated with friends, and gradually developed their understanding of the world. A 19-year-old who joined a movement was still a person in the process of becoming. Every person deserves the opportunity to continue becoming. Alex's death ended that process forever. The limited historical information available about his early life creates a painful silence. Unlike some victims whose journals, interviews, photographs, and personal histories survive, Alex's private experiences remain largely unknown. We do not have a complete record of his childhood dreams or his personal struggles. We cannot recreate every friendship he valued or every ambition he carried. That absence should not make him feel less real. In some ways, it makes remembering him even more important. Because many victims of violence disappear twice. First, they lose their lives. Then, over time, they risk losing their identities as people. The public remembers the crime but forgets the individual. The investigation becomes more famous than the person who needed justice. The controversy becomes louder than the voice that was silenced. Alex Rackley's story should not exist only as a footnote in discussions about the Black Panther Party, government surveillance, or political conflict. Those subjects are important. They help explain the environment surrounding his death. But they are not the whole story. At the center of everything was a young man. A person who had relationships. A person who had fears. A person who had hopes. A person whose future was taken away. The importance of remembering victims as individuals is especially significant in true crime storytelling. The genre has a responsibility beyond explaining what happened. It must also preserve the humanity of those who suffered. Without that balance, victims can unintentionally become objects of fascination rather than people deserving of empathy and respect. The details of a crime may attract attention. But the life before the crime is what gives that tragedy meaning. For Alex, that life existed during one of America's most intense periods of transformation. He lived at a time when young people were being told two competing messages. One message said the country was progressing. Another said progress had been painfully incomplete. One message encouraged patience. Another demanded immediate action. One message celebrated democratic institutions. Another questioned whether those institutions truly served everyone equally. Many young Americans struggled with these contradictions. They searched for communities where their concerns were taken seriously. They wanted to believe their actions mattered. For some, activism was not simply a political choice. It was a personal response to the world around them. A way of saying, I see what is happening, and I cannot remain silent. That desire to participate in change was one of the defining characteristics of the era. It inspired acts of courage. It inspired acts of compassion. It also existed alongside moments of terrible judgment. The same passion that motivates people to fight injustice can, under certain circumstances, become dangerous when combined with fear and unquestioned certainty. That contradiction is one of the central themes surrounding Alex Rackley's death. The people involved were not living in a simple world divided between obvious heroes and villains. They were living in a complicated world where ideals, emotions, and human weaknesses collided. Understanding that complexity does not mean ignoring responsibility. A person can understand the environment surrounding a crime while still recognizing the suffering caused by the crime itself. Both truths can exist together. Alex Rackley was killed during a period when many people believed they were fighting for a better future. Yet the circumstances of his death demonstrated one of history's most painful lessons. Even movements built around justice can experience moments when fear overwhelms compassion. That lesson remains relevant because it is not limited to one organization or one decade. Every group of people faces the challenge of balancing loyalty with accountability. Every community must decide whether suspicion will be answered with evidence or with assumption. Every individual must decide whether protecting a cause means abandoning basic human dignity. Those decisions may seem small when they are made. History reveals their consequences later. By the time Alex Rackley became the focus of a national murder investigation, the person he had been was already being replaced in the public imagination by the circumstances of his death. Reporters wanted answers. Prosecutors wanted accountability. Political figures wanted explanations. The public wanted to understand how such an event could occur. All of those questions mattered. But before seeking answers about what happened to him, there is one question that must come first. Who was the person who was lost? The answer is not found only in legal documents. It is found in the simple recognition that Alex Rackley was a 19-year-old human being living through a difficult moment in history. He was someone who believed in something. Someone who made choices based on the world as he understood it. Someone whose life contained possibilities that will never be known. His story is not only about the way he died. It is about the life that should have continued. The conversations that should have happened. The experiences he should have had. The person he might have become. And that is the tragedy at the heart of this case. Long before the name Alex Rackley became associated with controversy, investigation, and political debate, he was simply a young man standing at the beginning of adulthood. Unaware that his future would be taken from him and that his final days would force an entire nation to confront uncomfortable questions about fear, loyalty, justice, and the devastating consequences of losing sight of another person's humanity. The night Alex Rackley's life changed forever did not begin with a dramatic confrontation in the streets. There was no public warning. No moment when the city of New Haven realized that something terrible was about to happen. The world outside continued moving normally while, behind closed doors, a series of decisions were being made that would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing crimes connected to the Black Panther Party. On the surface, it appeared to be another ordinary day in a city already accustomed to tension. People walked through downtown streets. Cars moved through intersections. Restaurants served evening customers. Families returned home after work. The familiar routines of daily life continued without interruption. But inside the New Haven Black Panther headquarters, the atmosphere was different. The building was no longer simply a place for organizing community programs or discussing political ideas. According to later testimony and court records, it had become the location where suspicion surrounding Alex Rackley would reach its most dangerous point. The exact sequence of conversations and decisions during those hours has been reconstructed through witness accounts and legal proceedings, but the emotional atmosphere remains difficult to fully capture. What is known is that Alex was accused by some members of the organization of being an informant for law enforcement. The accusation carried enormous weight in a movement that believed infiltration could destroy everything they were attempting to build. An accusation became a question. The question became an interrogation. And the interrogation became violence. The transformation happened gradually, but once it began, it moved with terrifying momentum. Alex Rackley had entered an environment where trust had already become fragile. Suspicion did not begin with him alone. It existed before he arrived. It was part of the larger atmosphere surrounding political organizations during that era. Members feared that information could reach authorities. They feared raids, arrests, and imprisonment. They feared that one person's actions could endanger everyone. Those fears created a dangerous foundation. When people believe they are surrounded by hidden threats, they often become desperate for certainty. They search for explanations. They search for someone responsible. They search for a person who can be identified as the source of their danger. In this case, that person became Alex. The accusation against him was never proven through evidence before the violence occurred. Yet within the minds of those who accepted it, suspicion had already transformed into certainty. That transformation is one of the most frightening aspects of the case. Because once someone is labeled a traitor, every action can be interpreted through that label. A denial can sound like deception. Fear can appear like guilt. Silence can appear like confirmation. The accused person is no longer seen as an individual. They become a symbol of the threat people already fear. According to testimony later presented during the investigation, Alex was held inside the New Haven headquarters and subjected to repeated questioning. What began as an attempt to determine whether he had provided information to authorities became a prolonged ordeal of intimidation and abuse. The hours that followed would become the center of the prosecution's case. Inside that building, time moved differently. For Alex, every passing minute brought another reminder that the people surrounding him were no longer acting as friends or fellow activists. The individuals questioning him had accepted a belief about him, and they were determined to force an answer that matched that belief. Fear changes the way people experience time. A few seconds can feel endless. A short conversation can feel like an entire night. The human mind searches constantly for escape, for reassurance, for some indication that the situation will return to normal. But for Alex, normal was disappearing. Outside the building, New Haven continued unaware. A person buying groceries would not know what was happening. A driver passing down the street would not see anything unusual. Someone walking nearby might have looked at the building and seen nothing more than another location in the city. That contrast makes the event even more haunting. One reality existed outside. Another existed within. The outside world continued with ordinary concerns. Inside, a young man's fate was being decided. The people involved were not strangers who had suddenly crossed paths. That is what makes the case particularly disturbing. The violence did not come from an unknown attacker appearing from nowhere. It emerged from within a community built around shared beliefs and common goals. Betrayal carries a unique psychological weight because it attacks expectations. People are prepared to fear enemies. They are less prepared to fear those they believe stand beside them. The evidence later presented in court described a situation where Alex was not simply killed in an impulsive moment of anger. Instead, prosecutors argued that his death followed a period of questioning and abuse designed to obtain a confession. The purpose, according to testimony, was not merely punishment. It was confirmation. Those responsible wanted to prove their suspicion was correct. But no amount of suffering could transform an accusation into truth. No amount of violence could create evidence that did not exist. The tragedy was that by the time this reality became clear, Alex was already trapped inside a situation where reason had been replaced by fear. Eventually, the decision was made to move him from the headquarters. The city lights of New Haven faded as the vehicle traveled away. The familiar streets gave way to quieter roads. Buildings became fewer. The landscape became darker. The distance from witnesses increased. Every mile carried Alex farther away from any possibility of rescue. The journey itself represents one of the most chilling parts of the case. A person can understand danger in a familiar place. A person can recognize the possibility of seeking help when surrounded by others. But isolation changes everything. The farther someone is taken from ordinary life, the more powerless they become. The destination was a remote area in Middlefield, Connecticut. A place surrounded by nature. A place where voices could disappear. A place where the silence of the landscape would later conceal the final evidence of what had happened. When the vehicle arrived, the world around them remained indifferent. Trees stood silently. Water moved slowly through the marsh. The night continued. Nature does not recognize human tragedy. It does not stop when someone suffers. It does not announce when a life is about to end. That indifference creates some of the most haunting images in true crime history, a peaceful landscape holding the evidence of a terrible act. According to the investigation, Alex Rackley was shot and killed there. A 19-year-old man who had entered a political movement seeking purpose and belonging was now alone in a place far from where his story had begun. His final moments remain one of the most painful unanswered parts of the case. What did he think? Did he believe someone would stop? Did he continue trying to convince those around him that they were wrong? Did he understand that the people who had once been his allies had already made their decision? History cannot provide those answers. Only silence remains. But the consequences of that night would soon become impossible to ignore. The marsh that had hidden Alex's body would eventually become the beginning of an investigation that exposed the internal conflict, fear, and violence surrounding one of America's most controversial political movements. The people involved may have believed they were protecting something. They may have believed they were preventing a threat. But what they created instead was a tragedy that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Because when fear becomes stronger than compassion, when suspicion becomes stronger than evidence, and when a person is reduced to an accusation instead of remembered as a human being, the result is not justice. It is destruction. And on that night in May of 1969, the life of Alex Rackley became the devastating proof of how far that destruction could go. The journey away from New Haven was more than a physical movement from one location to another. It represented a point of no return. With every mile between the city and the isolated roads of Middlefield, the possibility of someone noticing, questioning, or intervening became smaller. The ordinary world faded behind them, replaced by darkness, silence, and a decision that had already crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. For Alex Rackley, that journey marked the final moments of a life that had only just begun. For those responsible, it marked the beginning of consequences that would follow them for decades. The road ahead was quiet. Connecticut's countryside at night carried a different atmosphere from the busy streets of New Haven. The sounds of the city disappeared gradually. Buildings became less frequent. Streetlights gave way to stretches of darkness broken only by occasional headlights passing in the opposite direction. To anyone driving along those roads that night, the vehicle carrying Alex would have appeared completely ordinary. That is one of the most unsettling realities of many crimes. From the outside, tragedy often looks invisible. A person can pass within feet of danger without ever knowing it exists. A neighbor can sleep peacefully while something horrific unfolds nearby. A city can continue its routines while one person's life is approaching its final moments. The world does not always reflect the seriousness of what is happening within it. Inside the vehicle, however, everything had changed. Alex was no longer simply facing an accusation. He was facing the consequences of people who had already decided what they believed to be true. That distinction is critical. Justice requires investigation. It requires evidence. It requires the willingness to accept that a person may be innocent even when suspicion feels convincing. What happened to Alex occurred because those principles were abandoned. The accusation against him had become more powerful than the possibility that the accusation itself could be wrong. Throughout history, this pattern has appeared repeatedly. Communities under pressure sometimes begin to view punishment as protection. They convince themselves that harsh actions are necessary because the threat feels too dangerous to ignore. The person being targeted stops being seen as an individual with a story and becomes instead a representation of a feared enemy. That transformation is often the first step toward unimaginable cruelty. Alex was no longer being treated as a 19-year-old man with a future. He was being treated as a problem to be solved. A danger to be removed. A question that required an answer. But people are not questions. They are not problems. They are not symbols. They are human beings. The failure to remember that truth would define the tragedy that followed. The location chosen for the final act was a wooded area near a swamp in Middlefield, Connecticut. Away from the crowded streets of New Haven, the area offered isolation. There were fewer witnesses. Fewer chances of interruption. The quiet landscape provided the opposite of everything that had surrounded Alex earlier in his life. The city where he had joined a movement. The meetings where he had discussed ideas. The communities where people searched for change. All of it was now far away. The marsh itself would later become one of the most haunting images associated with the case. A place that appeared peaceful became connected forever with violence. Trees that had existed for years before the crime continued standing afterward. Water continued moving through the wetlands. Seasons changed. Leaves fell and grew again. Nature continued. Human beings carried the memory. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, Alex was shot and killed at that location. The details surrounding those final moments became central to the prosecution's case and to the public understanding of what occurred. Investigators would later work to reconstruct the sequence of events, determine who participated, and understand how a group of people had moved from suspicion to murder. But before there was an investigation, there was silence. A silence that lasted until the discovery of Alex's body. For a short period after the killing, those responsible attempted to continue their lives. The city did not immediately know what had happened. There was no instant public alarm. No immediate recognition that a 19-year-old man had been murdered and left behind in a remote area. That delay created another disturbing contrast. Somewhere, a family was missing a son. Somewhere, questions were beginning. Somewhere, people were wondering where Alex had gone. Meanwhile, the world continued. This is one of the cruelest aspects of homicide. For the victim and those who love them, time stops. Every unanswered phone call carries meaning. Every passing hour creates more fear. Every possibility becomes another painful thought. For everyone else, life often continues normally. Cars still move. Businesses still open. People still make plans. The ordinary world can feel almost painfully indifferent. The search for Alex would eventually reveal the truth, but before investigators reached the marsh, there was uncertainty. His disappearance left behind questions. Where was he? Who had seen him last? Why had he vanished? Those questions would become the first steps toward uncovering a case that would soon attract national attention. As investigators began looking into Alex's disappearance, they would encounter a situation unlike many murder investigations. The suspected perpetrators were not unknown criminals hiding from society. They were members of a political organization already surrounded by controversy. The investigation would therefore unfold under intense public scrutiny, with every discovery interpreted through existing debates about race, activism, government surveillance, and political violence. The murder investigation would become inseparable from the larger historical moment. But before the politics, before the headlines, before the courtroom battles, there was a young man whose family needed answers. There was a body waiting to be found. There was a community about to confront an uncomfortable truth. The truth that danger had not come from outside the organization. It had come from within. When Alex Rackley's body was eventually discovered, the quiet landscape of Middlefield would become the beginning of the end for those who had participated in his death. The marsh that had been chosen because it offered secrecy would instead become the place where the truth began to emerge. Every crime leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are physical. Sometimes they are words spoken by witnesses. Sometimes they are contradictions that appear when stories fail to match. Sometimes they are the choices people make after the crime has already happened. The people involved believed they had removed a threat. Instead, they had created evidence. They had created witnesses. They had created a case that would expose their actions to the entire country. The murder of Alex Rackley was not only a tragedy because a young life was taken. It was a tragedy because the people around him had convinced themselves that taking that life was necessary. And once that decision was made, there was no returning to the world that existed before. The movement would face questions. The accused would face trial. The public would debate responsibility. Historians would examine the meaning of the case for generations. But none of those future events could change the most important fact. On a quiet night in Connecticut, a 19-year-old man who had once believed he was surrounded by allies was abandoned in a place where no one could hear him. And the silence that followed would soon be broken by the sound of an investigation searching for the truth. The hours after Alex Rackley's death carried a strange contradiction. For the people who knew him, time had suddenly become filled with fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. For the outside world, nothing appeared different. The streets of New Haven continued to move. Businesses opened their doors. People went to work. Students walked across campus carrying books and discussing ordinary concerns. The city continued its routine, unaware that beneath that ordinary surface, a 19-year-old man's disappearance was about to become a national story. That is often how tragedy begins. Not with the entire world stopping, but with one person's world ending while everyone else continues moving. The silence surrounding Alex's disappearance could not last forever. People noticed when he was gone. Friends noticed. Associates noticed. Those who expected to see him at meetings or around familiar places noticed. A person does not simply vanish without creating questions, especially within a close community where people are accustomed to seeing one another regularly. At first, those questions may have seemed ordinary. Where is Alex? Has anyone spoken with him? When was the last time someone saw him? But as time passed, ordinary questions began turning into serious concerns. The disappearance of a young man connected to a political organization already operating under pressure created immediate uncertainty. Every missing person case begins with limited information, but this situation carried additional complexity. The people searching for answers were also navigating an environment where trust had already become fragile. Everyone had a reason to wonder. Everyone had a reason to be cautious. The same atmosphere of suspicion that had contributed to Alex's death would now influence the investigation into it. Meanwhile, investigators would eventually begin piecing together the events that led from the New Haven headquarters to the quiet area where Alex's body had been left behind. Their work would require reconstructing a timeline from incomplete information, separating facts from rumors, and determining which statements could be trusted. That process would become increasingly complicated because the case involved not only a murder but a political organization. From the beginning, the investigation existed in a highly charged environment. For some observers, the case appeared to confirm fears about the Black Panther Party and the potential for violence within radical political movements. For others, the investigation raised questions about whether authorities would use the tragedy as an opportunity to attack an entire organization rather than focus only on the individuals responsible. The murder of Alex Rackley became surrounded by debates that extended far beyond the crime itself. But behind every political argument was still a basic human reality. A family wanted answers. A young man was dead. A crime had occurred. The first responsibility of any investigation was not ideology. It was truth. Investigators would soon discover that this case was unlike a typical murder where the suspect might be a stranger leaving behind few connections. Here, the trail led back toward people who knew Alex. People who had interacted with him. People who had shared the same organization and the same political environment. That made the investigation both easier and more difficult. Easier because investigators were not searching blindly for an unknown person. More difficult because the relationships involved were complicated. Friendships. Political loyalties. Fear. Group identity. Personal responsibility. All of these factors would influence what people said and what they refused to say. In criminal investigations, witnesses rarely provide perfect information. Memory changes. People interpret events differently. Some people reveal everything. Others protect themselves or those they care about. Some believe they are helping a larger cause by remaining silent. Investigators must navigate all of these human realities. They must look beyond individual statements and examine patterns. Who had access? Who had opportunity? Who knew what happened? Who changed their story? Who suddenly became quiet? The answers would begin emerging through a combination of physical evidence and witness testimony. But before the full investigation unfolded, one of the most important questions remained unanswered. Why Alex? Why did suspicion focus on him? What convinced certain members that he was an informant? Those questions would continue to shape discussions surrounding the case for decades. Because the most disturbing aspect of the murder was not only the violence itself. It was the reasoning used to justify it. The belief that a person's identity could be reduced to an accusation. The belief that suspicion could replace proof. The belief that eliminating one person could protect everyone else. History has shown repeatedly that groups under extreme pressure can become vulnerable to this kind of thinking. When survival feels threatened, people may begin making decisions based not on what they know, but on what they fear. Fear creates urgency. Urgency demands action. Action taken without evidence can create irreversible consequences. That chain of events is one of the central lessons of the Alex Rackley case. The investigation would reveal that the people involved were not operating in a vacuum. They were influenced by the political conflicts of their era, by genuine fears of government surveillance, and by internal struggles within their own organization. But regardless of those influences, one fact remained unchanged. Alex Rackley was not given the chance to defend himself. He was not given a fair hearing. He was not given the benefit of uncertainty. He was judged and condemned by people who believed they already knew the truth. And when investigators later examined the evidence, they would uncover a very different story. A story not of proven betrayal, but of a devastating accusation. A story not of justice, but of a murder carried out in the name of perceived necessity. The discovery of Alex's body would transform a hidden crime into a public reckoning. The quiet marshland of Middlefield would become connected forever with the name of a young man whose life ended far too soon. The New Haven chapter would face national scrutiny. The accused would face criminal charges. The broader movement would face difficult questions about leadership, accountability, and internal discipline. And America would be forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Violence does not always emerge from hatred alone. Sometimes it emerges from fear. Sometimes it emerges from people who believe they are protecting something important. Sometimes it emerges when individuals become so certain they are fighting against injustice that they fail to recognize the injustice they are creating themselves. That is what makes the murder of Alex Rackley such a powerful and painful case. It is not simply a story about a crime scene. It is a story about the choices made before the crime scene existed. The assumptions that were accepted. The warnings that were ignored. The humanity that was forgotten. And eventually, it would become a story about whether the justice system could uncover the truth when the truth itself had become buried beneath layers of politics, loyalty, and fear. The discovery of Alex Rackley's body transformed a hidden tragedy into a public investigation. Until that moment, The events surrounding his disappearance existed mostly within the walls of the New Haven Black Panther headquarters and among the small circle of people connected to him. The outside world continued unaware that a 19-year-old man had been subjected to violence and left behind in a quiet corner of Connecticut. Then the marsh revealed what had been hidden. The landscape that had been chosen because of its isolation became the place where the truth began to emerge. Middlefield, Connecticut, was not the kind of location most people associated with national controversy. It was a rural community shaped by forests, farmland, and winding roads. Unlike the crowded streets of New Haven, where political demonstrations, university debates, and community activism created constant movement, Middlefield offered quiet distance. The area contained the kind of natural stillness where a person could disappear from public view. That silence would not protect those responsible. Instead, it would become the beginning of their exposure. When Alex's body was discovered, investigators were immediately confronted with a scene that raised more questions than answers. A young man had been found dead in a remote area, far from the environment where he was last known to have been. The location suggested planning. It suggested that his death had not been the result of a random encounter or sudden street violence. Someone had brought him there. Someone had chosen that place. Someone believed the distance would provide secrecy. But crime scenes rarely remain silent forever. Every location holds evidence. Every movement leaves traces. Every decision creates consequences. The investigators who arrived at the scene were not simply looking at a body. They were looking at the final chapter of a sequence of events that had begun somewhere else. Their task was to work backward, reconstructing the path that led Alex from New Haven to Middlefield. Who had last seen him alive? Where had he been before his death? Who had been with him? How had he traveled there? Why had he been targeted? These questions would guide the investigation for months. The physical evidence at the scene became the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Investigators documented the location carefully, preserving details that might reveal what had happened. Every object, every mark, and every inconsistency could potentially provide information about the final moments of Alex's life. In homicide investigations, the first hours are often among the most important. Memories are still fresh. Evidence is less likely to be disturbed. People have not yet had time to coordinate explanations or reshape their stories. But this case presented an unusual challenge. The people who might hold answers were not strangers. They were individuals connected to Alex through a shared organization. They were people who understood the political environment surrounding the case. They were people who had reasons to protect themselves, their friends, or the movement they believed in. Investigators were not only searching for what happened. They were also trying to understand why. The motive behind a crime often determines how investigators approach the search for suspects. A robbery, for example, may lead detectives toward financial motives. A personal dispute may point toward someone close to the victim. But the murder of Alex Rackley existed within a complicated world of ideology and suspicion. The central question was not simply who killed Alex. It was what convinced someone that killing him was necessary. That question would become one of the defining challenges of the investigation. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding Alex's death, they began focusing on the events that occurred before he was taken to Middlefield. The timeline became increasingly important. Investigators needed to understand the hours between Alex's arrival at the New Haven headquarters and the moment his body was discovered. Every witness became significant. Every statement mattered. Every inconsistency demanded attention. The investigation would eventually reveal that Alex had been held and questioned at the headquarters before being taken away. The accusations against him had not emerged from evidence discovered after his death. They had existed beforehand, shaping the actions of those who believed them. This distinction would become crucial. Because the crime was not simply about what happened in the marsh. The marsh was only the final location. The true beginning of the tragedy occurred earlier, when suspicion was allowed to become certainty. As investigators continued their work, the case attracted growing attention. News organizations began reporting on the unusual circumstances surrounding the killing. The involvement of the Black Panther Party ensured that the investigation would not remain a local matter. The story touched on some of the most sensitive issues of the era: race relations, political activism, law enforcement, government surveillance, and the limits of ideological loyalty. Almost immediately, different groups interpreted the case through different perspectives. Some saw it as proof that the Black Panther Party contained dangerous elements capable of extreme violence. Others argued that the case existed within a broader context of government pressure and hostility toward activist organizations. Still others focused primarily on the victim himself and the need for justice. The public debate was intense because the case represented more than a single murder. It reflected the conflicts of an entire era. But inside the investigation, detectives faced a more immediate task. They needed facts. Politics could explain the environment. It could explain the tensions. It could explain why suspicion existed. But it could not replace evidence. Evidence would determine what happened. The first major breakthroughs would come not from the crime scene alone, but from understanding the relationships between the people involved. Investigators began examining the network surrounding Alex. They looked at who had interacted with him before his death, who had knowledge of the accusations against him, and who might have information about the events leading to the killing. In many cases, a murder investigation begins by asking, who wanted to harm this person? In this case, the question became more complicated. Who believed they had a reason? Who believed they were justified? Who crossed the line between accusation and action? Those distinctions would matter greatly during the legal proceedings that followed. Because the investigation was not only about identifying individuals. It was about revealing a process. A process in which fear, suspicion, and group pressure combined to create a situation where a young man could be treated as guilty without proof. The discovery of Alex Rackley's body ended one mystery. But it opened another. The world now knew that Alex was dead. The next challenge was discovering how and why. As investigators left the quiet marshland of Middlefield and began following the trail back toward New Haven, they entered a case unlike any other they had handled. The evidence would lead them into a world where political beliefs, personal relationships, and criminal responsibility were deeply intertwined. And slowly, piece by piece, the hidden events behind Alex Rackley's final hours would begin coming into the light. The investigation into Alex Rackley's death quickly became a race against time. Every homicide investigation begins with uncertainty, but this case carried an unusual level of complexity. The victim was not discovered in the location where the suspected conflict had begun. The people who might have answers were not distant strangers. They were connected through the same organization, the same political environment, and, in some cases, the same friendships that had existed before suspicion turned into violence. Investigators had to separate two different worlds. The world of political conflict and the world of criminal evidence. One explained the atmosphere. The other would determine responsibility. The first task was reconstructing Alex's final movements. Detectives needed to understand how a young man who had been associated with the New Haven Black Panther chapter ended up dead in a remote Connecticut marsh. Every hour before his death mattered. Every person who had interacted with him became potentially important. Investigators began examining the timeline. Where had Alex been before his disappearance? Who had contacted him? Who had seen him? What conversations had taken place? The answers would slowly form a picture of a crime that had not happened suddenly, but had developed through a series of decisions. As detectives looked deeper, they discovered that Alex's death was connected to events at the Black Panther headquarters in New Haven. The building that had once represented organization, activism, and community work was now the center of a murder investigation. That reality created a powerful contrast. A place designed around ideas of social change had become associated with an act of violence. A location where members gathered to discuss justice had become the location where someone was accused, judged, and harmed without the protections of a legal system. For investigators, The question was not whether the political beliefs of the organization were right or wrong. The question was what happened to Alex Rackley. That distinction became important because the case immediately attracted national attention. The Black Panther Party was already one of the most controversial political organizations in America. News of a murder involving its members created intense reactions from people who already held strong opinions. Some commentators viewed the case as confirmation of their worst fears about militant political groups. Others believed the attention surrounding the investigation could be used to discredit an entire movement. But inside the investigation, detectives had to ignore the noise. They needed names. They needed timelines. They needed testimony. They needed evidence that could survive in court. One of the most significant challenges was the relationship between loyalty and silence. In close communities, especially those facing outside pressure, people may hesitate to cooperate with authorities. They may fear consequences. They may believe that speaking openly could damage a cause they support. They may also fear being labeled a traitor themselves. This created a complicated environment for investigators. The same fear that had contributed to the crime could also interfere with discovering the truth. Witnesses had to decide whether protecting an organization was more important than revealing what had happened to a 19-year-old man. That decision was not always simple for those involved. The investigation revealed that multiple people had knowledge of Alex's treatment before his death. Statements from individuals connected to the New Haven chapter became central to understanding the sequence of events. Some witnesses described what they had seen. Others provided information about conversations and decisions that occurred before Alex was taken away. Slowly, the image of a random killing began to disappear. What emerged instead was a planned act connected to an internal accusation. The investigation showed that Alex had not been targeted because of a personal argument or an isolated confrontation. The circumstances surrounding his death were tied to a belief held by certain members that he had betrayed the organization. But investigators faced a critical question. Was that belief based on fact? Or was it based on fear? The evidence would suggest that the accusation itself had become the driving force behind the crime. That distinction changed everything. A murder motivated by a proven threat is one thing. A murder motivated by an unverified suspicion is something entirely different. The legal system is built around the idea that accusations require proof. A person cannot be punished because others believe something about them. Evidence must replace assumption. Facts must replace rumors. The tragedy of Alex Rackley's death was that those protections were denied to him. There was no courtroom where evidence was presented. No defense attorney arguing on his behalf. No impartial jury deciding his fate. Instead, a group of people made that decision themselves. And the consequences were irreversible. As investigators continued gathering information, the case began moving toward arrests. The evidence pointed toward several individuals connected to the New Haven chapter. Among those eventually charged were people who had played different roles in the events leading to Alex's death. The investigation did not simply reveal a crime. It revealed a chain of responsibility. Some individuals were accused of direct participation. Others faced questions about leadership, authority, and whether they encouraged or approved what happened. Those distinctions would become central during the trials. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the involvement of prominent Black Panther Party figures. Because of the organization's national profile, the investigation quickly expanded beyond local accusations. The possibility that senior leadership might have been involved transformed the case from a Connecticut homicide into a national political controversy. But regardless of public attention, the foundation of the case remained the same. A 19-year-old man was dead. The evidence needed to explain why. The investigation also exposed the devastating consequences of internal suspicion. Even before any trial began, the case raised difficult questions about what happens when organizations facing external threats begin turning their own fears inward. How does a group protect itself without destroying trust? How does a movement maintain discipline without abandoning basic rights? How does a community respond to possible betrayal without becoming unjust itself? These questions extended far beyond the courtroom. They became part of the historical legacy of the case. The discovery of Alex's body had opened the door. The investigation now pushed further inside. Detectives followed every connection, examined every statement, and searched for the exact moment when suspicion became action. Because somewhere between the first accusation and the final shot, a series of choices had been made. Choices by individuals. Choices shaped by fear. Choices that would soon be examined under the harsh light of a courtroom. The people involved may have believed they were protecting a movement. Instead, they created one of the most damaging scandals associated with that movement's history. And as the evidence continued to emerge, the question facing investigators became clearer. Not only who killed Alex Rackley, but how did so many people allow it to happen? As investigators continued pulling apart the timeline of Alex Rackley's final days, one of the most disturbing realities of the case became increasingly clear. The murder was not the result of a single moment of uncontrolled anger. It was the result of a chain of decisions, each one creating the conditions for the next. The investigation was no longer simply searching for the person who fired the fatal shot. It was examining how suspicion, fear, and loyalty had combined to create an environment where such a decision became possible. Every investigation begins with evidence. But every investigation also begins with people. People who remember events differently. People who carry their own fears. People who have their own reasons for speaking or remaining silent. The investigators working on the Alex Rackley case had to navigate those human complexities while trying to uncover a factual sequence of events. The first major challenge was determining what happened inside the New Haven headquarters before Alex was taken away. The crime scene in Middlefield showed the final result, but it could not explain the decisions that led there. The answers were located somewhere earlier in the timeline. The headquarters became the center of attention. Inside those walls, investigators believed, the accusation against Alex had grown into a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Witness accounts became essential. Statements from people connected to the chapter began revealing details about the atmosphere surrounding Alex. Investigators learned that he had been questioned about suspicions that he was cooperating with authorities. The issue was not a confirmed act of betrayal supported by evidence. Instead, the case centered around a belief held by certain individuals who had become convinced that Alex could not be trusted. That distinction would become one of the most important elements of the entire investigation. Because the question was never simply whether people were afraid. Fear can be understandable. Fear can be real. Fear can exist even when danger is uncertain. The question was what people chose to do with that fear. The law recognizes that suspicion alone cannot justify punishment. A person accused of a crime has rights precisely because human beings can be wrong. History is filled with examples of individuals who were falsely accused, misunderstood, or judged by rumors rather than facts. Alex Rackley was not given those protections. Instead, according to evidence presented later, the accusation against him became a justification for violence. As investigators examined witness statements, they began identifying the roles of different individuals involved in the events. Some were accused of direct participation. Others became connected through decisions they allegedly made or actions they allegedly supported. The investigation revealed that responsibility in a case like this was not limited to one person standing in one location. Crimes often involve a sequence. Someone makes a decision. Someone follows. Someone remains silent. Someone fails to intervene. Each action or inaction can become part of the larger story. That reality made the case particularly complicated. The public often wants a simple answer. One person to blame. One moment to identify. One explanation that makes everything understandable. But the truth of violent crimes is often more uncomfortable. Sometimes a tragedy is created by a series of choices made by multiple people, each one contributing to an outcome that none may have fully considered at the beginning. The investigation into Alex's murder forced authorities, courts, and the public to confront that complexity. As details emerged, the case also became a battle over interpretation. The prosecution viewed the events as a murder carried out after a false accusation. Defense attorneys and supporters of some defendants raised questions about evidence, individual responsibility, and the broader political context. Outside the courtroom, the debate became even wider. The Black Panther Party had already been a subject of intense national controversy. Government agencies had considered it a significant political threat, and the organization had been targeted by surveillance efforts. Because of that history, some observers questioned whether the investigation would focus fairly on the specific individuals accused or whether it would become another chapter in the broader conflict between authorities and activist movements. Those questions reflected genuine historical tensions. But they existed alongside another undeniable reality. A young man had been killed. His death required answers. The investigation could not ignore the political environment, but neither could it allow politics to replace evidence. The evidence would need to determine what happened. As investigators built their case, the importance of testimony became increasingly clear. People who had been present during parts of the events became crucial sources of information. Their accounts helped authorities reconstruct conversations, movements, and decisions that otherwise would have remained hidden. But testimony also introduced challenges. Witnesses are human. They remember events through personal experiences. They may fear consequences. They may struggle with guilt. They may disagree about details. Investigators must examine not only what someone says, but why they say it. Does the statement match physical evidence? Does it fit the timeline? Does it remain consistent over time? These questions shaped the investigation. The case became a careful process of separating truth from uncertainty. Eventually, the evidence gathered by investigators led to arrests. The names connected to the murder became public. The story that had begun in a quiet Connecticut marsh now moved into newspapers, courtrooms, and national conversations. The investigation had succeeded in answering one question. Alex Rackley had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. But another question remained. Who should be held responsible? That question would become the focus of the legal battles ahead. Because responsibility existed on multiple levels. There was the person or people directly involved in the killing itself. There were those accused of participating in the events leading to his death. And there were questions about leadership, influence, and whether individuals in positions of authority had encouraged actions that ultimately resulted in tragedy. The courtroom would eventually become the place where these questions were examined. But before the trials began, the investigation had already revealed something deeply unsettling. The greatest danger facing Alex had not come from an unknown enemy outside the organization. It came from people who believed they were acting in defense of something important. That contradiction would define the case for decades. The Black Panther Party had emerged from a desire among many members to confront injustice, protect communities, and demand change. Yet the murder of Alex Rackley showed how dangerous any movement could become when fear replaced evidence and when loyalty was valued above individual rights. The discovery in Middlefield had started the process. The evidence had begun to speak. The hidden events behind Alex's final hours were slowly becoming visible. And as the case moved toward the courtroom, America prepared to witness a trial unlike almost any other of the era, a trial where the facts of one young man's death would collide with some of the nation's deepest political conflicts.